Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The scream that echoed through the forest that night wasn't human. I've been a ranger for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like it. It was a sound that made my blood run cold and my skin prickle with goosebumps. Little did I know, it was just the beginning of the most terrifying night of my life. My name's Jack, and I've been working at Blackwood National Park since I was fresh out of college. I've seen my fair share of strange things out here in the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in late October. It was a typical autumn evening, crisp and cool with a hint of wood smoke in the air from campers' fires. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on the campsites and making sure everyone was following park rules. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. As darkness fell, I noticed the forest seemed unusually quiet. No chirping crickets, no hooting owls, just an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I was about to head back to my cabin when I heard it. A blood-curdling scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It started low, almost like a growl, then rose to a piercing shriek that echoed through the trees. My heart raced as I tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. It wasn't a mountain lion or a bear. I knew those calls well. This was something different. Something I'd never encountered before. Without hesitation, I grabbed my flashlight and radio, then headed into the dense forest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and move with a life of their own. I called out, hoping it was just a lost hiker, or maybe some teenagers playing a prank. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. As I pushed deeper into the woods, the air grew colder and a thick fog began to roll in, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots and my own ragged breathing. I tried to radio for backup, but all I got was static. I was on my own. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the soft earth, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boots, with strange claw-like indentations at the tips. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What kind of animal could leave tracks like these? I followed the prints, my flashlight beam shaking slightly as my hand trembled. They led me deeper into the forest, to a part of the park I rarely visited. The trees here were old, gnarled things, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I could have sworn I saw shapes moving in the fog just at the edge of my vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The beam of my flashlight caught a glimpse of something large moving between the trees. It was too big to be a bear, and it moved with an almost human-like gait. For a split second, I saw a pair of eyes reflecting in the light. Eyes that were far too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root, and I fell hard onto the forest floor. My flashlight flew from my hand, spinning as it hit the ground and illuminating the scene in terrifying flashes. In those brief moments of light, I saw it. A massive, hulking shape covered in dark fur. It stood on two legs, towering over me at what must have been 8 or 9 feet tall. Its face was a nightmarish mix of human and animal features, with a protruding snout and teeth that gleamed wickedly in the flashlight's beam. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. The creature took a step toward me, and I could hear its heavy breathing, smell the musky animal scent of its fur. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and loped off into the darkness. The sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves faded into the distance, leaving me alone in the silent forest. I don't know how long I lay there, my heart racing, every nerve in my body on high alert. It could have been minutes or hours before I finally found the strength to move. With shaking hands, I retrieved my flashlight and stumbled to my feet. I had to get out of there, had to warn someone about what I'd seen. The journey back to my cabin was a blur of shadows and paranoia. Every sound made me jump. Every movement in the corner of my eye sent a jolt of fear through my body. When I finally burst through the door of my cabin, I slammed it shut and locked it, then collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my cabin, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I ventured out, half convinced that the events of the night had been some sort of vivid hallucination, but the footprints were still there, huge and undeniable in the morning light. And there, caught on a branch at the edge of the clearing, was a tuft of coarse, dark fur. I've been a ranger for a long time, and I've always prided myself on my rational, scientific approach to the natural world. But what I saw that night defied explanation. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't any known animal. The locals have whispered about creatures in these woods for generations. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Wendigo. I used to laugh off these stories as superstition and folklore. Now, I'm not so sure. I reported the incident to my superiors, of course. They listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They sent out a team to investigate, but they found nothing conclusive. The footprints were dismissed as belonging to a large bear, the fur as likely from a wolf or coyote. But I know what I saw. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research, poring over local legends and cryptozoology books. I interviewed old-timers in the nearby town, listening to their stories of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena in the forest. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that there was something out there, something that defied our understanding of the natural world. I still work as a ranger at Blackwood National Park. I still do my rounds, check on campers, and maintain the trails. But now, I always carry a camera with me, always keep my eyes and ears open for anything unusual, and when the sun goes down and the forest grows dark, I can't help but wonder what's out there, watching from the shadows. Some nights, when the wind is right, I think I can hear that scream again, echoing through the trees. It sends a chill down my spine every time, a reminder of that terrifying encounter. I don't know if I'll ever see that creature again, or if I even want to, but one thing's for certain, I'll never look at these woods the same way again. The encounter changed me, made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. There are things out there in the dark places of the earth that we can't explain, things that blur the line between reality and myth, and sometimes, if you're not careful, you might just come face to face with them. So if you're ever hiking in Blackwood National Park, and you hear a strange sound in the night, or see a shadow move where no shadow should be, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away, because out here in the wilderness, where the old forests grow thick and the mountains touch the sky, anything is possible. And not all legends are just stories. Story 2. The moment I saw the footage, I knew our camping trip had taken a terrifying turn. What started as a peaceful getaway in the wilderness became a nightmare that would haunt us for years to come. I never believed in monsters or cryptids, but after what happened in those woods, I'm not so sure anymore. My name's Sarah, and I've been an avid camper for most of my life. I thought I'd seen it all. Bears, mountain lions, even the occasional moose. But nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered on that fateful weekend in the Cascade Mountains. It was supposed to be a fun trip with my best friends, Alex and Mike. We'd been planning it for months, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and reconnect with nature. The first day was perfect, clear skies, crisp mountain air, and the kind of silence you can only find deep in the wilderness. We set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and the sound of a nearby stream. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, trading stories and roasting marshmallows. It felt like old times, just the three of us against the world. The trouble started on the second day. We woke up to find our food cache ransacked. At first, we thought it might have been a bear or maybe some particularly bold raccoons. But something felt off. The way our supplies were scattered didn't look like the work of any animal I'd encountered before. "Maybe we should set up the trail cam," Alex suggested, pulling out the small device from his backpack, just in case our visitor comes back. We agreed, setting up the camera facing our food storage area. Little did we know that decision would change everything. As night fell, we huddled around the campfire, our conversation punctuated by nervous glances into the darkness beyond. The forest seemed different somehow, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. We were about to turn in for the night when we heard it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a roar. It was something entirely alien, something that sent shivers down my spine and made my heart race. "What was that?" Mike whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could answer, we heard heavy footsteps approaching our campsite. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a bear. We scrambled into our tent, zipping it shut as if that flimsy barrier could protect us from whatever was out there. Through the thin fabric, I could see a massive shadow moving around our campsite. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, almost human-like in their gait. For what felt like hours, we sat in terrified silence, listening to the creature rummage through our supplies. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, feel the trembling of Alex's hand as he gripped my arm. Finally, as dawn began to break, the sounds faded away. We waited another hour before cautiously emerging from our tent. The campsite was a disaster. Our food was gone, backpacks torn open, equipment scattered everywhere. But it was the footprints that made my blood run cold. They were enormous, easily twice the size of a human foot, with strange, claw-like impressions at the tips. They were bipedal tracks, walking upright like a person, but no person could have left prints like these. "And we need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "Now!" As we hastily packed up what remained of our gear, Alex remembered the trail camera. With shaking hands, he retrieved it and turned it on. What we saw on that tiny screen would haunt my dreams for years to come. The footage was grainy and dark, but unmistakable. A massive, bipedal creature, covered in thick, shaggy fur, moved through our campsite with an unsettling mix of animal and human-like movements. Its arms were long, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws, but it was the face that struck terror into my heart, a bizarre blend of ape-like features and something almost human, with eyes that reflected the camera's infrared light like glowing coals. We stood there, frozen in shock. As the reality of what we'd just seen sank in, this wasn't a bear, wasn't any known animal. This was something straight out of a nightmare. "We need to show this to someone," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The rangers, the police, anyone." But as we turned to leave, a twig snapped in the forest behind us. We spun around, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the creature from the video. In broad daylight, it was even more terrifying. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its massive frame covered in matted, dark fur. Those glowing eyes fixed on us with an intelligence that seemed impossible for an animal. For a moment, time stood still. We stared at the creature, and it stared back at us. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it turned and disappeared into the dense underbrush. We didn't wait around. We ran, abandoning half our gear in our haste to get back to the trailhead. The 3-mile hike felt like a marathon, every shadow and rustling leaf making us jump. By the time we reached my car, we were exhausted, terrified, and forever changed. The rangers listened to our story with skepticism, even when we showed them the video. They suggested it might be a hoax, or maybe a bear walking on its hind legs, but we knew what we'd seen. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else entirely. In the days and weeks that followed, I threw myself into research, poring over books on cryptozoology and local legends. I found stories of similar creatures stretching back centuries, tales of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and other mysterious bipedal beasts roaming the wilderness. Had we encountered one of these legendary creatures? The experience changed me. I used to feel at home in the wilderness, but now every cracking twig or rustle in the underbrush sends my heart racing. I still go camping, still love the outdoors, but there's always a part of me on high alert, wondering what might be watching from the shadows. Alex, Mike, and I don't talk about that night much. It's like an unspoken agreement between us. We know what we saw, know it was real, but discussing it only brings back the fear and disbelief we felt in those terrifying moments. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself re-watching the video from the trail cam. I've analyzed it frame by frame, looking for any sign that it might be fake, that there might be a rational explanation. But every time, I'm left with the same chilling conclusion. There are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that blur the line between legend and reality. I've been back to those woods since then, drawn by a mix of fear and fascination. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes, when the wind is right, I think I can hear that strange, guttural call echoing through the trees. It's a reminder that the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine, that there are still mysteries out there waiting to be discovered, or perhaps waiting to discover us. So if you're ever camping in the wilderness and you hear something strange in the night, or see a shadow move where no shadow should be, remember our story. Remember that not all legends are just stories, and that sometimes the monsters from our nightmares might just be real. As for me, I'll keep exploring, keep searching for answers. Because now that I know what's out there, I can't look at the world the same way again. Every forest holds the potential for wonder and terror, every shadow the possibility of the unknown. And while part of me is afraid of what I might find, a bigger part is excited by the prospect of unraveling one of nature's greatest mysteries. After all, isn't that what exploration is all about? Pushing the boundaries of what we know, challenging our assumptions about the world around us. That night in the Cascades may have been the most terrifying experience of my life, but it was also the most exhilarating. It opened my eyes to a world of possibilities I never knew existed. So the next time you're in the great outdoors, keep your eyes open and your mind ready, because you never know what you might encounter out there in the wild. And who knows? Maybe you'll be the one to finally prove that these creatures are more than just campfire stories and blurry photographs. Just remember to bring a camera and maybe some extra food. You never know who or what might be hungry out there in the dark. Story 3. The moment I realized I wasn't alone in those woods, my entire world shifted. What started as a routine hunting trip turned into a heart-pounding encounter that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. They say the forest holds many secrets, but some are better left undiscovered. My name's Tom, and I've been hunting these mountains since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I know every trail, every ridge, every hidden glen in these parts. Or at least, I thought I did. That day in late November showed me just how little I really knew about what lurks in the shadows of the wilderness. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out, the kind of day that makes you glad to be alive and out in nature. The air was sharp, with the scent of pine and decaying leaves, and a light mist hung in the valleys, giving the landscape an almost otherworldly quality. I'd been tracking a particularly elusive buck for days, and I had a good feeling about my chances. As I made my way deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods were too quiet, no birdsong, no scurrying of small animals in the underbrush, just an eerie silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I'd been hiking for a couple of hours when I first noticed the tracks. At first glance, they looked like bear prints, but something about them made me pause. They were too big, too human-like in their shape, and they were fresh, the edges still crisp in the soft earth. Whatever had made them was close. That's when I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck when you know you're being watched. I spun around, my rifle at the ready, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. I tried to convince myself it was just nerves, that I was letting the silence and solitude get to me. But then I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion. It was something I'd never heard before, something that made my blood run cold. My heart pounding, I began to make my way back the way I'd come. But with each step, I became more and more certain that I was being followed. Twigs snapped behind me, branches rustled, and all the while that feeling of being watched grew stronger. I picked up my pace, no longer caring about stealth or tracking. All I wanted was to get back to my truck, to get out of these woods that suddenly seemed so alien and threatening. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, not 20 yards ahead of me, stood the largest creature I'd ever seen. It was easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. For a moment my mind refused to process what I was seeing. It looked like a man, but no man could be that big, that inhuman. Its arms were too long, ending in hands tipped with wicked-looking claws. And its face, God, its face was a nightmare, a blend of human and animal features, with eyes that gleamed with an intelligence that had no place in a wild beast. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, staring at each other. I could hear its heavy breathing, smell the musky odor of its fur. My finger trembled on the trigger of my rifle, but I couldn't bring myself to raise it. Somehow, I knew that if I made any sudden moves, I was dead. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and loped off into the underbrush. The sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves faded into the distance, leaving me alone with my pounding heart and racing thoughts. I don't remember much about my trip back to the truck. It's all a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. Every shadow seeming to hide another monster, every sound a potential threat. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, I sat there for a long time, hands shaking, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. I scoured the internet for similar stories, pored over books on cryptozoology and local legends. I found tales of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and other mysterious creatures that had been sighted in these mountains for generations. Had I seen one of these legendary beasts? I went back to those woods many times after that day, armed with cameras and recording equipment. I never saw the creature again, but I often felt that same sensation of being watched. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd hear that low, rumbling growl echoing through the trees. It both terrified and fascinated me. The experience changed me. I used to see the forest as a place I understood, a world I could navigate with confidence. Now, every time I step into the woods, I'm acutely aware of how little I really know. There are things out there, in the wild places of the world, that defy explanation, things that blur the line between reality and myth. I've told my story to a few people over the years. Some believe me, some think I'm crazy, or that I mistook a bear for something more fantastical. But I know what I saw. That creature was no bear, no known animal. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist, but somehow does. These days, I still hunt, still spend time in those mountains, but I do it with a new sense of respect and caution. I'm more aware of my surroundings, more attuned to the subtle signs of the forest, and always, I keep an eye out for tracks that are a little too big, a little too human-like. I've never shared the exact location of my encounter. Part of me wants to protect whatever it is that's out there. Another part fears what might happen if the wrong people found out. But I've made it my mission to gather evidence, to try and prove that these creatures are more than just campfire stories. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out at the dark line of trees visible from my back porch. I think about that day, about the creature I saw, and I wonder, are they out there right now, watching us as we watch for them? Do they know how close we sometimes come to discovering their secret world? I may never have all the answers, but that encounter in the woods opened my eyes to a world of possibilities I never knew existed. It taught me that there are still mysteries out there, still wonders to be discovered, and while part of me is afraid of what else might be hiding in the shadows, a bigger part is excited by the prospect of unraveling one of nature's greatest enigmas. So if you're ever out in the wilderness and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the monsters from our childhood stories might be more real than we ever imagined. As for me, I'll keep exploring, keep searching, because now that I know what's out there, I can't look at the world the same way again. Every forest holds the potential for wonder and terror, every shadow the possibility of the unknown. And while part of me is afraid of what I might find, a bigger part is driven by the thrill of discovery. After all, isn't that what exploration is all about? Pushing the boundaries of what we know, challenging our assumptions about the world around us? That day in the woods may have been the most terrifying experience of my life, but it was also the most exhilarating. It showed me that there's still magic in the world, still mysteries to be solved. So the next time you're in the great outdoors, keep your eyes open and your mind ready, because you never know what you might encounter out there in the wild. And who knows? Maybe you'll be the one to finally prove that these creatures are more than just legends and blurry photographs. Just remember to bring a camera and maybe leave the rifle at home. Some discoveries are better made with an open hand than a clenched fist. Story 4. There are moments in life when the world around you shifts, and something as ordinary as a quiet walk in the woods becomes something far more sinister. I've been hiking alone for years, always enjoying the solitude, the silence, the escape from everything. But that one day, on a trail I thought I knew, something changed. Something was watching me. The day started like any other. I packed light, a water bottle, some snacks, and my trusty pocket knife. Not that I'd ever really needed it for anything more than cutting a rope or opening a stubborn granola bar wrapper. I chose a familiar trail, deep in a forest, just an hour's drive from my home. It was mid-autumn, the trees shedding their orange and yellow leaves, covering the ground in a soft, crackling blanket. I had always found peace in that sound, like nature was whispering beneath my feet, guiding me along the path. The air was crisp, cool, but not too cold, the kind of weather that wakes you up and clears your head. I took a deep breath, enjoying the earthy smell of fallen leaves and damp soil. The trail was quiet. No other hikers today. That wasn't unusual for a weekday afternoon. Most people were at work or didn't have the patience for long hikes with no phone service. But I liked the isolation. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. The forest was quieter than usual. At first, I didn't pay much attention. It could have been my imagination, but as I kept walking, the absence of sound became more pronounced. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush, just the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. My instincts kicked in. I stopped and looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing, just endless trunks stretching up to the sky, branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I pushed the unease aside and continued on, but not without a sense that something was off. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something strange on the ground. Footprints, large ones, much larger than any human could make. My first thought was that they belonged to a bear, but the shape wasn't right. They looked like wolf prints, but wolves weren't supposed to be this big. These prints were deep, as if something heavy had passed through recently. I squatted down, examining them more closely. The pads were wide, the claws sharp and long, but it was their size that unsettled me the most. I felt a chill run down my spine as I traced the outline of one print with my finger. It was easily the length of my forearm. I straightened up, scanning the area again. The forest remained eerily still, but now it felt like it was watching me, like it was waiting. I told myself it was just an animal, bears maybe, or some strange dog breed, something explainable. But as I kept walking, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. My pace quickened. The trail ahead seemed longer than I remembered, the trees darker, the air colder. Then I heard it, a low growl, distant but unmistakable. My heart stopped for a second, and I froze in place. The sound came from somewhere behind me, deep in the woods. I turned, squinting into the trees, but saw nothing. Just the same, endless forest, silent and still. But the growl, it was real. It wasn't my imagination. I started walking again, faster now, my pulse pounding in my ears. I kept looking over my shoulder, every few steps convinced that something was following me. I told myself it was just a deer or a coyote, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Another growl, closer this time. It was low and guttural, a sound that made my skin crawl. I turned again, my hand instinctively going to the knife in my pocket. The forest was still empty, but now there was a heavy presence in the air, like the woods themselves were alive and watching. And then I saw it. Between the trees, maybe 50 yards back, something moved. It was fast, darting between the trunks in a blur of shadow and fur. I only caught a glimpse, but it was enough to know that whatever it was big, bigger than me, bigger than any animal I had ever seen. My legs moved before my brain could catch up. I started running, my breath coming in quick, sharp bursts as I sprinted down the trail. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the trees, but behind me I could hear something else. Heavy, rapid footfalls. Something was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, my heart hammering in my chest. The trail seemed endless now. The trees closing in on me, the path ahead twisting and turning in ways that felt unfamiliar. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I couldn't stop, not with whatever that thing was right behind me. The growling grew louder, more aggressive, and I could hear the snapping of branches as it barreled through the forest. It was gaining on me. Suddenly, the trail opened up into a small clearing. I stumbled into the open, gasping for breath, and spun around. For a moment, everything was quiet again. The forest stood still, the only sound my ragged breathing. I looked around, my eyes darting from tree to tree, expecting to see the creature emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the trees and the underbrush, silent and undisturbed. I waited, my chest heaving, my hand gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. Minutes passed. I couldn't hear the growling anymore. No footsteps, no rustling in the bushes, just silence. Maybe it was gone. I took a hesitant step forward, my muscles trembling from the adrenaline. Then another. I was about to start walking again when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the line of trees, was the creature. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick dark fur, its limbs long and muscular. But its face was what terrified me the most. It was like a wolf, but wrong, twisted. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was filled with sharp, gleaming teeth. It stood on 2 legs, hunched over slightly, its claws hanging at its sides. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. My heart raced in my chest, and I could feel the weight of its gaze, heavy and predatory. Then it took a step forward, and I bolted. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, tearing through the trees, branches whipping at my face and arms. I didn't care. I just had to get away. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with every second. I didn't know how far I ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. My lungs were on fire, my legs burning with exhaustion, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not until I burst out onto the trailhead, where my car was parked. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside. slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, I just sat there, gasping for air, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers went numb. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature standing there at the edge of the parking lot, watching me, but it was gone. I don't know how long I sat there, heart pounding, sweat dripping down my face. Eventually, I started the car and drove away, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't look back. I couldn't. That was the last time I hiked alone. I still go out sometimes, but never by myself, and I never go back to that trail. I don't know what I saw that day. Maybe it was some kind of animal, something rare or mutated. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but every time I think back to those glowing eyes and that twisted, snarling face, I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't just an animal. It was something else. Something that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. Story 5. It's funny how the deepest parts of the wilderness can make you feel completely alone one minute and utterly vulnerable the next. We always went camping to escape the noise of the world, to sit under the stars and listen to the wind move through the trees. But there's something about the silence of nature that can turn from peaceful to oppressive when you sense something watching. That trip out there in the mountains was the first time I ever felt truly afraid of the woods. We were deep into a 5-day camping trip in a remote area of the Appalachian Mountains. No cell service, no marked trails, just the 4 of us and the endless expanse of trees. I was with my 3 closest friends, Jake, who always took charge of planning these trips, Sarah, who loved hiking almost as much as Jake, and Mark, who just came for the beer and the stories around the campfire. Me, I was in it for the solitude. Or at least I thought I was, before everything changed. The first couple of days were uneventful, beautiful even. We hiked through thick forests, crossed a few shallow streams, and set up camp in the valley between 2 ridges. The weather was perfect, sunny during the day and cool enough at night to enjoy a fire. We'd spend the evenings telling stories, laughing, and just enjoying the escape. By the 3rd day, the deep isolation had settled in, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only people in the world. But then, that night, something shifted. It started as a sound, a distant, almost rhythmic crashing, like something big was moving through the trees nearby. At first, none of us paid much attention. Bears, elk, whatever it was, animals moved through the woods all the time. But this sound was different. It wasn't just the occasional rustling of underbrush or snapping of twigs. It was deliberate, and it was getting closer. Jake, being Jake, was the first to get up and grab a flashlight. Probably just a deer," he muttered, though his eyes were sharper than his words let on. He wasn't convinced either. He swept the beam of light across the tree line, but there was nothing to see, just the same old forest, dense and quiet, except the quiet was wrong. That's what hit me then. The forest had gone dead silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no owls calling from the trees. The only sound was the crackle of our campfire and that slow, steady thumping of something big moving through the woods. Sarah stood up next to Jake, her face drawn tight with unease. "Do you think it's a bear?" she asked, but no one answered. We all knew it wasn't. It was something else. I tried to shake it off, blaming the eerie quiet for putting me on edge. But the footsteps, or whatever they were, didn't stop. After a while, they just faded back into the forest, like whatever was out there had decided to leave us alone. But the air was thick with tension, and no one relaxed. Mark tried to lighten the mood, cracking open another beer and tossing me one, grinning like nothing was wrong. "Probably just the wind or something," he said. "Let's not lose our minds out here." I forced a smile, cracked the can open, and took a long sip. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew it wasn't the wind. The fire burned lower as the night dragged on, but sleep wouldn't come easy. I could tell by the way Sarah kept tossing and turning in her sleeping bag, and the occasional grunt of frustration from Jake. Mark, on the other hand, was snoring loud enough to scare off any real wildlife. I finally drifted off just as the fire started to die, but the rest didn't last long. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, the kind of waking where every sense is on high alert. The fire was down to embers, casting a dull orange glow around the campsite. I sat up, trying to figure out what had startled me awake, when I heard it again, those same heavy, deliberate footsteps, closer this time, much closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My mind raced with a dozen possibilities, each one worse than the last. Bear? Mountain lion? Someone else out here, messing with us? Slowly, I reached over to wake Jake, but as I turned, I saw him already sitting up, his eyes wide and focused on the edge of the camp. He wasn't moving, wasn't blinking. He was staring at something in the darkness just beyond the reach of the dying firelight. "Do you see that?" he whispered, so low I barely heard him. I followed his gaze, squinting into the black. At first, there was nothing, just the shadows of trees, but then, there, something was standing just beyond the trees, tall and dark, its silhouette barely visible against the deeper shadows of the forest. It was massive, towering over the bushes, easily over 7 feet tall, and it wasn't moving. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it, heart pounding in my chest. I could barely make out the shape of it, but it was broad, its shoulders impossibly wide, and it seemed to be covered in thick fur or hair. I felt paralyzed, like my body wouldn't listen to me, frozen with fear. Jake slowly reached for the flashlight, but the moment the beam flickered on me, the thing moved. It was fast, unnaturally fast. It darted behind the trees, disappearing into the forest with barely a sound. The flashlight beam wavered as Jake's hand shook, sweeping the woods in vain. For a moment, we just sat there, frozen, hearts racing, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Jake didn't answer. He just kept the flashlight pointed at the trees, like he was waiting for it to come back. Sarah stirred in her sleeping bag, sitting up with a groggy look on her face. "What's going on?" "Why are you guys—" "Shh," Jake hissed, holding up a hand. "Don't move." The fear in his voice shut her up immediately. She looked between us, wide-eyed, and then followed our gaze to the tree line. Whatever was out there, she knew it wasn't normal. The footsteps started again, circling us now, slow and deliberate, crunching the dry leaves underfoot. My heart pounded in my ears, each step getting closer, then moving farther away as if it were toying with us, and then, all at once, the footsteps stopped. Silence again. I could barely breathe, waiting, every nerve on edge. We all sat there, motionless, listening, nothing. The minutes ticked by, stretching longer and longer. Maybe it was gone, but then a branch snapped directly behind me. I whipped around, but I was too slow. A massive figure lunged out of the trees, just on the edge of the firelight. It was fast, too fast. My brain struggled to make sense of it, to process what I was seeing. It was covered in thick, dark fur, moving on 2 legs, towering over us. I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes filled with something primal, something that made my blood run cold. Jake was already on his feet, backing away, and I scrambled to follow. The thing, whatever it was, didn't make a sound as it moved. It circled around us, keeping to the shadows, but never straying too far from the edge of the light. I don't know how long we stood there, paralyzed, waiting for it to make a move. Every muscle in my body was tense, ready to run, but something about the way it watched us, the intelligence behind its movements, told me that running wouldn't help. It was faster than us, stronger. It knew these woods better than we did. Suddenly, Jake shouted, breaking the silence, "Get to the tent, now!" I didn't think, I just reacted. We dove for the tent, zipping it up behind us in a desperate attempt to put some kind of barrier between us and the creature, but I knew it was useless. If it wanted to, it could tear through the thin fabric like paper. The footsteps stopped again. Outside, the forest was silent. My breathing was loud, ragged, and I could hear Sarah stifling sobs next to me. Mark, finally awake, was wide-eyed and shaking but silent, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing was gone. The rest of the night was spent in a tense, sleepless silence, waiting for it to return, but it never did. By morning, we packed up camp in record time, not saying a word to each other. We hiked out of the woods without stopping, not daring to look back. I never went camping after that. Whatever we saw that night, whatever was watching us out there, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't human. Story 6. The first time I heard the howl, I dismissed it as just another wolf. By the third night, I knew we were dealing with something far more sinister. As the local sheriff of Pinewood Creek, I've seen my fair share of strange occurrences, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror that gripped our town that fateful week in October. My name's Jim Hawkins, and I've been the sheriff here for going on 20 years. Pinewood Creek is your typical small mountain town. Everybody knows everybody, and not much happens beyond the occasional bar fight or teen vandalism. At least, that's how it used to be. It all started on a chilly Tuesday evening. I was just finishing up my nightly patrol when dispatch crackled to life. Old Man Jenkins was reporting strange noises coming from the woods behind his property. Now, Jenkins was known for being a bit of a paranoid sort, always calling in about one thing or another, so I didn't think much of it at first. When I pulled up to Jenkins' place, I could see him standing on his back porch, shotgun in hand, peering out into the darkness. As I approached, I heard it, a long, mournful howl that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't like any wolf call I'd ever heard before. There was something almost human about it. "See, I told you, Sheriff, that ain't no ordinary wolf," Jenkins said, his voice shaking. "There's a werewolf, mark my words," I chuckled, trying to ease the tension. "Now, Mr. Jenkins, let's not jump to conclusions. Probably just a coyote or something. I'll take a look around, make sure everything's all right." But as I swept my flashlight across the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness, eyes that were far too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. In a blink, they were gone, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. I reassured Jenkins that everything was fine and headed back to the station, but that howl stayed with me. It echoed in my dreams that night, mixing with visions of glowing eyes and shadowy figures. The next day brought more reports. Hikers claiming they'd seen a massive, wolf-like creature walking on two legs. Farmers finding their livestock torn apart in a way that didn't match any known predator. And always, that haunting howl in the night. By Friday, the whole town was on edge. People were locking their doors, keeping their kids inside. The local diner was abuzz with wild theories and half-whispered stories of werewolves and monsters. I did my best to keep everyone calm, to find a rational explanation for what was happening, but deep down, I was starting to wonder if there might be some truth to the legends. That night, I decided to stake out the area where most of the sightings had occurred. Deputy Sarah Johnson insisted on coming with me, despite my protests. As we sat in the patrol car at the edge of the woods, the tension was palpable. "Do you really think there's something out there, Sheriff?" Sarah asked, her eyes scanning the darkness. I sighed, choosing my words carefully. "I don't know what to think anymore, Sarah, but whatever it is, we're gonna find it and put an end to this madness." Hours passed with nothing but the rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Just as I was about to call it a night, we heard it, that bone-chilling howl, closer than ever before. Sarah and I exchanged a look before grabbing our flashlights and stepping out of the car. The woods were eerily silent as we made our way through the underbrush. Every snapping twig made us jump, every shadow seemed to move, and then we saw them. Footprints in the soft earth. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boot, with claw-like indentations at the tips. "Sheriff," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, those look like... I know." I cut her off, not wanting to hear it said out loud, because saying it would make it real, would force us to confront the impossible. We followed the tracks deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, and a thick mist began to swirl around our feet. That's when we heard the growl, low, guttural, and unmistakably close. Slowly, We turned, our flashlight beams cutting through the mist. And there it was, standing not 20 feet away. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and wolf features, with eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow in the beam of our lights. For a moment, time stood still. We stared at the creature, and it stared back at us. I could hear Sarah's ragged breathing beside me, could feel my own heart threatening to burst out of my chest. My hand inched towards my gun, though I doubted it would do much good against this thing. The creature's lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. It took a step towards us, and that's when Sarah panicked. She fired off a shot, the sound deafening in the quiet forest. The bullet hit the creature in the shoulder, and it roared in pain and fury. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her along as we tore through the woods. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind us, its howls of rage echoing through the trees. We burst out of the forest and sprinted for the patrol car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, the creature emerged from the trees. In the harsh glare of the headlights, it looked even more terrifying. Blood matted the fur on its shoulder where Sarah's bullet had struck. Its eyes blazed with an inhuman intelligence and fury. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was going to charge us. But then, with one last bone-chilling howl, it turned and loped back into the darkness of the forest. The drive back to town was a blur. Sarah and I sat in shocked silence, trying to process what we'd just seen. How could we explain this to anyone? Who would believe us? In the days that followed, we searched those woods from top to bottom. We found more tracks, tufts of coarse hair caught on branches, and areas where the underbrush had been smashed flat as if something large had bedded down there. But of the creature itself, we found no further sign. The official report cited an unusually large wolf as the culprit behind the livestock killings and strange noises. Most people seemed content with this explanation, eager to put the whole terrifying episode behind them. But there were some, those who had seen something in the woods or heard that unearthly howl, who knew the truth. As for me, I'll never forget that night in the forest. It changed me, changed how I see the world. I used to think I had a pretty good handle on reality, on what was possible and what wasn't. Now, I'm not so sure. I still patrol these streets, still protect this town, but every time I drive past those woods, I can't help but peer into the darkness, wondering if a pair of glowing eyes might be staring back at me. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I sometimes think I can hear that howl again, drifting on the breeze. Some secrets, I've learned, are better left uncovered. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. But I know what I saw that night, what Sarah and I encountered in those misty woods. And I know that somewhere out there, in the wild places of the world, there are things that defy explanation, things that blur the line between reality and nightmare. So if you're ever driving through Pinewood Creek and you hear stories about the beast in the woods, don't be too quick to dismiss them. And if you're feeling brave enough to go hiking in our forests, keep your wits about you, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the reach of your flashlight beam. As for me, I'll keep watching, keep protecting this town as best I can. But I do it with a new understanding of just how big and mysterious this world really is. And every full moon, I make sure to lock my doors, load my gun, and say a little prayer. Because in Pinewood Creek, we know that not all legends are just stories, and sometimes the monsters are all too real. Story 7. The blizzard came out of nowhere, but that wasn't the worst of it. As we huddled in our makeshift shelter, we realized we weren't alone in these mountains. Something was out there, something that shouldn't exist, and it was hunting us. My name's Alex, and I've been leading hiking expeditions in the Rockies for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all: bears, mountain lions, the occasional moose. But nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered on that ill-fated trip last winter. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day hike, just me and a group of 5 experienced trekkers. We'd done this route before, a challenging but beautiful trail that wound through some of the most pristine wilderness in Colorado. The forecast had called for clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect hiking weather. We set out early on a crisp Friday morning, spirits high and packs laden with supplies. The first day went smoothly, with breathtaking views of snow-capped peaks and valleys blanketed in evergreens. We made good time, setting up camp in a sheltered clearing as the sun began to dip below the horizon. That's when things started to go wrong. The temperature dropped rapidly as night fell, far below what it should have been for that time of year. Wind began to howl through the trees, and heavy clouds rolled in, obscuring the stars. By midnight, we were in the midst of a full-blown blizzard. We hunkered down in our tents, hoping to wait out the storm. But as dawn broke, it was clear we were in trouble. The snow was already knee-deep and still falling heavily. Visibility was near zero. "We need to find better shelter," I told the group, having to shout to be heard over the wind. "There's an old ranger cabin about 2 miles from here. If we can make it there, we'll be safe until this blows over." It was a risky move, but staying put wasn't an option. We'd freeze to death if the storm didn't let up soon. So we packed up what we could and set out into the whiteout. The going was brutal. Every step was a struggle against the wind and snow. I kept a constant count, making sure no one fell behind. We'd been walking for what felt like hours when I saw it, a dark shape moving through the trees, just at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks in the swirling snow. But then I saw it again. Clearer this time. It was big, much bigger than a person, moving on 2 legs with a gait that was somehow both animal and human-like. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't say anything to the others. We had enough to worry about without me adding tales of mysterious creatures to the mix, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed. Just as I was starting to fear we'd missed the cabin, it loomed out of the white haze. It was old and weathered, but solid, a haven in the storm. We piled inside, grateful for the shelter from the relentless wind and snow. As we warmed up and took stock of our supplies, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. The encounter in the woods kept replaying in my mind, and now, in the relative quiet of the cabin, I could have sworn I heard something moving outside, circling our shelter. Night fell, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. We rationed our food, knowing we might be stuck here for days. As the others tried to sleep, I kept watch by the single grimy window, peering out into the darkness. That's when I saw them, 2 glowing eyes, far too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, staring directly at me from the tree line. My blood ran cold. This was no trick of the light, no product of an overactive imagination. Something was out there, watching us. I must have made a noise, because Lisa, one of the hikers, stirred and came to stand beside me. "What is it, Alex? What do you see?" Before I could answer, we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion. It was something I'd never heard before, something that made every instinct scream danger. "Everyone up!" I shouted, grabbing for my rifle. "Something's out there." The others scrambled awake, confusion turning to fear as that unearthly growl sounded again, closer this time. We huddled in the center of the cabin, eyes fixed on the door, which suddenly seemed far too flimsy a barrier. For hours, we listened to it circle the cabin, heard its heavy breathing and the crunch of its footsteps in the snow. Occasionally, it would let out that bone-chilling growl, as if to remind us it was still there, still waiting. As dawn approached, the sounds faded away. The storm, too, began to abate. We waited another hour before cautiously venturing outside. What we found made my blood run cold. Enormous footprints circled the cabin, easily twice the size of my own boots. They were oddly shaped, almost human-like, but with claw marks at the tips. And there, caught on a branch at eye level, far higher than any of us could reach, was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. The others saw it too. There was no denying the evidence before us. What? What was that thing? Mike, the youngest of our group, asked, his voice shaking. I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years in these mountains, I'd heard stories, legends of Bigfoot, of wild men in the woods. I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales, but now, faced with this evidence, I wasn't so sure. We need to get out of here, I said finally. The storm's past. We make for the ranger station, fast as we can. No one argued. We packed up quickly, constantly scanning the trees around us. The hike down was tense, every snapping twig or rustle of branches making us jump. More than once, I caught glimpses of something large moving in the forest alongside us, always just out of clear sight. When we finally reached the ranger station and safety, we were met with skepticism. The rangers listened to our story, looked at the photos we'd taken of the tracks, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. They chalked it up to bare activity and the stress of being caught in the storm. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. In the weeks and months that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about our encounter. I researched cryptozoology, local legends, anything that might explain what we'd experienced. I found stories stretching back centuries of similar creatures in these mountains, tales of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and other mysterious bipedal beasts. I've been back to those mountains many times since then, always keeping an eye out, always listening for that distinctive growl. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes, when the wind is right, I think I can hear its call echoing through the valleys. The experience changed me. I used to see the wilderness as something familiar, something I understood. Now, every time I step into the backcountry, I'm acutely aware of how little we really know about what's out there. I still lead expeditions. I still love these mountains. But I do it with a new respect for the unknown, for the mysteries that still lurk in the wild places of the world, and I always make sure to pack a little extra food. You never know who or what might be out there, watching from the shadows. So if you're ever hiking in the Rockies and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, like you're being watched, or you hear a growl that doesn't quite sound like any animal you know, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away, because sometimes, just sometimes, the legends are true, and the monsters from our campfire stories might be more real than we ever imagined. As for me, I'll keep exploring, keep searching for answers, because now that I know what's out there, I can't look at the world the same way again. Every forest holds the potential for wonder and terror, every shadow the possibility of the unknown. And while part of me is afraid of what I might find, a bigger part is driven by the thrill of discovery. After all, isn't that what exploration is all about? Pushing the boundaries of what we know, challenging our assumptions about the world around us? That night in the mountains may have been the most terrifying experience of my life, but it was also the most exhilarating. It showed me that there's still magic in the world, still mysteries to be solved. So the next time you're in the great outdoors, keep your eyes open and your mind ready, because you never know what you might encounter out there in the wild. And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to finally prove that these creatures are more than just legends and blurry photographs. Just remember to bring a camera and maybe some extra supplies. You never know who or what might be hungry out there in the dark. Story 8. The moment I captured that image, I knew my life would never be the same. What started as a routine wildlife photography expedition turned into a heart-stopping encounter that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but some photos tell stories that defy explanation. My name's Jake, and I've been a wildlife photographer for the better part of 2 decades. I've trekked through jungles, scaled mountains, and waded through swamps to get the perfect shot. I thought I'd seen it all, captured it all, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Pacific Northwest. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out, my backpack loaded with gear and my mind buzzing with anticipation. I'd heard rumors of an unusual animal sighting in this remote corner of the forest, and I was determined to be the one to document it. Little did I know, I was walking into an experience that would blur the line between reality and legend. The forest was eerily quiet as I made my way deeper into the wilderness. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow up even the sound of my own footsteps. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the excitement of the hunt getting to me. I'd been hiking for hours, stopping occasionally to set up camera traps, when I first heard it, a low, guttural vocalization that echoed through the trees. It wasn't a bear, wasn't an elk. It was something I'd never heard before, something that sent a shiver down my spine. Intrigued and slightly unnerved, I moved towards the sound, my camera at the ready. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement between the trees, something large and bipedal. My heart raced as I raised my camera, hardly daring to breathe as I waited for another glimpse. And then it stepped into a clearing, and I felt my world tilt on its axis. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. But it wasn't the size that shocked me, it was the way it moved. Bipedal, with an almost human-like gait, but far too large and powerful to be a man. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape-like features and something almost human, with eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural intelligence. For a moment, time stood still. I stared at the creature, and it stared back at me. I could hear my own heart thundering in my ears as my finger instinctively pressed the shutter button. Click, click, click. Each shot felt like it was shattering the silence of the forest. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and loped off into the underbrush. The sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves faded into the distance, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and a camera full of impossible images. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to process what I'd just seen. My hands shook as I reviewed the photos on my camera's display. There it was, in pixelated glory, a creature that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the stuff of campfire stories and blurry newspaper photos, and I had crystal-clear images of it. The gravity of what I'd captured began to sink in. This wasn't just the shot of a lifetime, it was potentially world-changing evidence. My mind raced with the implications. Should I share these photos? Would anyone believe me? Or would I be labeled a hoaxer, a fraud? Lost in thought, I almost didn't notice the snapping twig behind me. I whirled around, camera clutched to my chest, and found myself face to face with the creature once again. This time, it was close enough that I could smell its musky animal scent, see the steam of its breath in the cool air. Time seemed to stretch as we regarded each other. I saw curiosity in its eyes, an intelligence that belied its bestial appearance. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my camera. The creature watched, unmoving, as if it understood what I was doing. Click. The sound of the shutter seemed to break the spell. The creature's expression changed, a flicker of what looked almost like anger crossing its face. Before I could react, it lunged forward, faster than anything that size had any right to move. I felt a searing pain in my arm as the creature's massive hand swatted at my camera. The force of the blow sent me stumbling backward, my precious gear flying from my grasp and smashing against a nearby tree. Terror gripped me as I scrambled away, certain that this was how I was going to die, torn apart by a creature that wasn't supposed to exist. But the killing blow never came. When I looked back, the creature was kneeling by the broken remains of my camera, methodically destroying the memory card. It looked up at me one last time, and I swear I saw something like regret in its eyes. Then, with a grace that belied its size, it turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the wreckage of my equipment. I don't remember much about my trip back to civilization. It's all a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. When I finally made it back to my cabin, I collapsed into a chair, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced. The days that followed were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to shout my discovery from the rooftops, to share the truth of what I'd seen with the world. But another part, the part that remembered the intelligence in the creature's eyes and the deliberate destruction of my camera, held me back. I threw myself into research, poring over books on cryptozoology and local legends. I found stories stretching back centuries of similar creatures in these forests, tales of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and other mysterious bipedal beasts. Had I encountered one of these legendary creatures? And if so, what responsibility did I bear to keep it secret? The experience changed me profoundly. I used to see the wilderness as a canvas for my art, a place to capture and share the beauty of nature. Now, I understand that some things are not meant to be captured, some secrets not meant to be shared. I still take photos. I still venture into the wild places of the world, but I do it with a new respect for the unknown, for the mysteries that still lurk in the shadows of our modern world. And I always keep an eye out for movement in the trees, for a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring at the empty space on my wall where those photos would have hung. I wonder about the creature, about whether it's still out there, still guarding its secret, and I wonder if I made the right choice in keeping silent. But then I remember the intelligence in its eyes, the almost human expression of regret as it destroyed my camera. And I know that some truths are better left undiscovered, some mysteries better left unsolved. So if you're ever in the deep woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, or you hear a sound that doesn't quite fit, don't be too quick to reach for your camera, because sometimes the most important moments are the ones we can't capture, the experiences we can't share. As for me, I'll keep exploring, keep searching for that perfect shot, but now I do it with the knowledge that there are things out there beyond our understanding, creatures that walk the line between myth and reality, and while part of me still yearns to share my discovery with the world, a bigger part understands the importance of keeping some secrets. After all, isn't that what true discovery is about? Not just finding something new, but understanding when to share that knowledge and when to let it remain hidden. That day in the forest may have cost me the photo of a lifetime, but it gave me something far more valuable, a glimpse into a world beyond our own, and the wisdom to know when to let that world remain a mystery. So the next time you're out in nature, by all means, bring your camera, capture the beauty of the world around you. But remember that some things can't be captured in pixels and print. Some experiences are meant to live only in memory, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats where wonder and mystery still reside. And who knows, maybe one day you'll have your own encounter with the unknown. Just remember, sometimes the most powerful images are the ones we carry in our hearts, not our cameras. Story 9. The moment those kids stumbled out of the woods, wide-eyed and babbling about a man-bear, I knew this camping trip had taken a turn into uncharted territory. As a seasoned park ranger, I've heard my fair share of tall tales, but something about their story sent chills down my spine. Little did I know it was just the beginning of a night that would challenge everything I thought I knew about these forests. My name's Mike, and I've been a ranger at Whispering Pines National Park for going on 15 years now. I thought I'd seen it all. Lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, the occasional UFO enthusiast, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that warm July evening. It started out as a routine night. I was making my rounds, checking on the various campsites scattered throughout the park. The air was thick with the scent of pine and campfire smoke, crickets providing a constant backdrop of chirps and trills. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. That all changed when I pulled up to the Johnson family's campsite. They were regulars, came up every summer with their kids, but tonight something was off. Sarah Johnson was pacing back and forth, her face etched with worry. Her husband, Tom, was trying to calm her down, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Everything all right here, folks?" I asked as I stepped out of my truck. Sarah whirled around, relief flooding her face. "Oh, Mike, thank goodness you're here. The kids, they were playing hide and seek and they came back talking crazy. Tom finished for her, running a hand through his hair. And about some kind of creature they saw in the woods. My first thought was bear. We'd had a few black bear sightings that summer, nothing too concerning, but enough to keep us on our toes. But as the two young Johnson kids, Amy and Jack, came out of the tent, the looks on their faces told me this was something different. It was big. Ranger Mike, Amy said, her eyes wide. Bigger than Daddy, and it stood up like a person. Jack nodded vigorously. But it was all hairy, like a bear. A man-bear. I knelt down to their level, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. Now, kids, are you sure about what you saw? Sometimes our eyes can play tricks on us in the forest. But they were adamant. They described in vivid detail a large, bipedal creature covered in dark fur. According to them, it had been watching them from behind a cluster of trees, and when they spotted it, it had let out a low growl before disappearing into the underbrush. As I listened to their story, I felt a growing unease. These weren't the kind of kids prone to making up stories, and the fear in their eyes was all too real. Plus, there was something about their description that tickled at the back of my mind, reminding me of old legends I'd heard whispered around campfires. "All right," I said, standing up. "Why don't you folks stay put in your campsite? I'm going to take a look around, see if I can find any signs of whatever it was the kids saw." Tom insisted on coming with me, and I didn't argue. We grabbed flashlights and headed into the woods, following the direction the kids had indicated. The forest was eerily quiet as we walked, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw them, footprints in a patch of soft earth. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boots, with a shape that was unsettlingly human-like, but with claw marks at the tips of the toes. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What the hell?" Tom whispered, his voice shaky. Before I could respond, we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. Tom and I exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated fear. "Back to the campsite," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." We turned and hurried back, the feeling of being watched pressing in on us from all sides. As we emerged from the tree line, I saw Sarah standing at the edge of the campsite, her face pale in the glow of the lantern. "Did you find anything?" she asked. I hesitated, not wanting to alarm her further. "Let's get everyone inside the RV," I said instead. "I'm going to call for backup." As I radioed in, requesting additional rangers and animal control, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints from my mind. What the hell were we dealing with here? The next few hours were tense. We huddled in the Johnsons' RV, jumping at every sound from the forest. I tried to keep everyone calm, but I could feel the fear and uncertainty radiating from all of us. It was nearing midnight when we heard it again, that same inhuman growl, closer this time. Then the sound of heavy footsteps circling the campsite. Something large brushed against the side of the RV, making it rock slightly. The kids whimpered, burying their faces in their mother's arms. Tom gripped a baseball bat, his knuckles white. And me, I sat there, my hand on my service pistol, knowing deep down it would probably be useless against whatever was out there. For what felt like hours, we listened to it move around outside. Occasionally, we'd hear that bone-chilling growl, as if it was reminding us it was still there, still waiting. As dawn began to break, the sounds finally faded away. We waited another hour before cautiously venturing outside. The campsite was a mess. Coolers overturned, camping chairs scattered, and there, in the soft earth around the RV, were those same massive footprints. By the time backup arrived, the creature, whatever it was long gone. We scoured the area but found no further sign of it beyond more tracks leading deep into the forest. The official report cited an unusually large bear as the culprit, but I knew better. We all did. In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I researched cryptozoology, local legends, anything that might explain what we'd encountered. I found stories stretching back centuries of similar creatures in these forests, tales of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and other mysterious bipedal beasts. The experience changed me. I used to see the forest as something familiar, something I understood. Now, every time I step into the woods, I'm acutely aware of how little we really know about what's out there. I still work as a ranger. I still love these forests. But I do it with a new respect for the unknown, for the mysteries that still lurk in the wild places of the world, and I always keep an extra flashlight handy, just in case. The Johnson family, they still come camping every summer, but now they stick a little closer to their campsite, and they never let the kids play in the woods after dark. Can't say I blame them. So if you're ever camping in Whispering Pines, and you hear a growl that doesn't quite sound like any animal you know, or see a shadow move where no shadow should be, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away, because sometimes, just sometimes, the monsters from our campfire stories might be more real than we ever imagined. As for me, I'll keep patrolling these woods, keep watching for signs of the unexplained. Because now that I know what's out there, I can't look at the world the same way again. Every shadow holds the potential for wonder and terror, every unexplained sound the possibility of the unknown. And while part of me is afraid of what I might find, a bigger part is driven by the need to understand, to uncover the truth behind the legends. After all, isn't that what being a ranger is all about? Protecting the wilderness, yes, but also exploring it, understanding it in all its mysterious glory. That night may have been the most terrifying experience of my life, but it was also the most exhilarating. It showed me that there's still magic in the world, still mysteries to be solved, and who knows, maybe one day I'll be the one to finally prove that these creatures are more than just campfire tales and blurry photos. Until then, I'll keep watching the woods, keep listening for that telltale growl, and if you're ever in Whispering Pines, keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know what you might encounter out there in the wild. Just remember, some stories are better left untold, and some creatures are better left undiscovered, at least until we're ready to face the truth of what's really out there in the darkness beyond the campfire's glow. Story 10. The moment I saw the carcass of my prized bull, I knew this wasn't the work of any ordinary predator. 30 years I've been ranching these hills, and I'd never seen anything like it. Little did I know, that mangled heap of flesh and bone was just the beginning of a nightmare that would change everything I thought I knew about the wild. Name's Frank Hollister, and I run the Double H Ranch, about 50 miles outside of Boise. It's been in my family for generations, and I thought I knew every inch of this land, every creature that called it home. But that crisp October morning showed me just how wrong I was. It started like any other day. I was up before dawn, coffee in hand, ready to make my rounds. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and wood smoke, and a light mist hung over the pastures. Everything seemed peaceful, normal. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a dark shape in the field, maybe a fallen tree branch, but as I got closer, the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. It was Thunderbolt, my best breeding bull, or what was left of him. The carcass was torn apart, ribs exposed, innards scattered across the grass, but it wasn't the gore that chilled me to the bone. It was the precision of it. This wasn't the frenzied work of a pack of coyotes or even a bear. This was deliberate. I've seen my share of animal attacks over the years, but this was different. The cuts were clean, almost surgical in places, and the sheer strength it must have taken to bring down a 2,000-pound bull, it didn't make sense. As I stood there, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing, I noticed something else. Tracks. Big ones. At first glance, they looked almost human, but much larger, and with claw marks at the tips. A chill ran down my spine as I realized whatever had done this had walked away on 2 legs. I called the sheriff, of course. Old Jim Hawkins had been a friend for years, and I trusted him to take this seriously. When he arrived, I saw the color drain from his face as he surveyed the scene. "Jesus, Frank," he muttered, kneeling to examine the tracks. "You ever seen anything like this before?" I shook my head, words failing me. Jim radioed for backup, and soon the pasture was crawling with deputies and animal control officers. They took photos, made casts of the prints, asked me the same questions over and over, but I could see the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken assumption that this was just some kind of bizarre prank, or that I was exaggerating. As the day wore on and the officials cleared out, I was left alone with my thoughts and a gnawing sense of unease. Whatever had done this was still out there, and I had a sinking feeling it wasn't done. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every rustle of wind through the trees had me on edge. I sat by the window, rifle across my lap, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. It was nearing dawn when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the house. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before, wasn't anything I could explain. My dogs, usually quick to bark at any disturbance, were dead silent, cowering under the porch. Heart pounding, I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The beam of light cut through the pre-dawn gloom, catching on something at the edge of the yard. A pair of eyes reflecting back at me, far too high off the ground to be any normal animal. For a moment, time stood still. I stared at those eyes, and they stared right back at me. There was an intelligence there, a consciousness that sent a shiver down my spine. Then, with a speed that defied its size, the creature turned and loped off into the woods. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours. When I finally gathered the courage to investigate, all I found were more of those massive, human-like prints leading off into the forest. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I installed security cameras around the property, doubled my patrols. The local paper ran a story about the attack, sparking a flurry of speculation. Some folks said it was just a bear. Others whispered about government experiments gone wrong. A few of the old-timers muttered about legends. Stories passed down through generations of something living in these hills that was neither man nor beast. It was on the fourth night that the cameras caught it. The footage was grainy, the lighting poor, but there was no mistaking what I saw. A massive, bipedal creature, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. It moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, more like a man than any animal I'd ever seen. I must have watched that video 100 times, trying to convince myself it was a hoax, a man in a suit, anything but what it appeared to be. But deep down, I knew the truth. The creature from the old stories, the thing that went bump in the night. It was real, and it was here, on my land. Word got out, of course. It wasn't long before my ranch was overrun with reporters, amateur cryptozoologists, and thrill-seekers hoping to catch a glimpse of the Boise Bigfoot. I tried to keep them away, to protect whatever it was that was out there, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. Weeks passed, and the frenzy died down. There were no more attacks, no more sightings. Life on the ranch slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be when you know there's something out there defying explanation, but I couldn't let it go. I found myself spending more and more time in the woods, searching for signs, trying to understand. I pored over books on local legends, spoke with tribal elders about their stories of wild men in the forest. The more I learned, the more I realized how little we truly knew about the world around us. It was a crisp evening in late November when I saw it again. I was checking the fences at the far end of the property when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. There it was, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. This time I didn't run. I didn't reach for my rifle. I just stood there, heart racing, as we regarded each other. Up close, I could see the intelligence in its eyes, the almost human expression on its face. For a moment, I felt a connection, an understanding that transcended species. Then, with a nod that seemed almost respectful, it turned and melted back into the forest, leaving me with a head full of questions and a heart full of wonder. That was the last time I saw the creature, but not the last time I felt its presence. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I'll hear that distinctive growl echoing through the hills. I'll find tracks at the edge of the property, or tufts of coarse hair caught on the fences. The experience changed me, changed how I see the world. I used to think I understood nature, understood my place in it. Now I know better. There are things out there beyond our comprehension, creatures that walk the line between legend and reality. I still run the ranch, still tend to my cattle, but I do it with a new respect for the wilderness that surrounds us, for the mysteries that still lurk in the shadows. I've become more of a steward than an owner, protecting not just my livestock, but the secrets of these hills. So if you're ever driving through these parts and you hear stories about the creature in the woods, don't be too quick to dismiss them. And if you're feeling brave enough to go hiking in our forests, keep your wits about you, because you never know what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. As for me, I'll keep watching, keep listening, because now that I know what's out there, I can't look at the world the same way again. Every shadow holds the potential for wonder, every unexplained sound, the possibility of the unknown. And while part of me is still afraid of what might be lurking in the dark, a bigger part is grateful for the reminder that there's still magic in the world, still mysteries to be solved. After all, isn't that what life's all about? Not just surviving, but discovering, wondering, and sometimes coming face to face with the impossible. That night may have been the most terrifying of my life, but it was also the most profound. It taught me that the line between reality and myth is thinner than we think, and that sometimes the most incredible discoveries are the ones we never saw coming. So keep your eyes open and your mind ready, because you never know when you might stumble upon a truth that changes everything. Just remember, some secrets are meant to be kept, some mysteries left unsolved. At least until the world is ready to face the reality of what's really out there, watching us from the wild places beyond the edge of civilization. Story 11. It's easy to laugh off the old legends when you're warm and safe at home, surrounded by four walls and a roof. But when you're out there, alone in the wilderness with nothing but a thin cabin wall between you and whatever lurks in the dark, the stories feel a lot more real. I never believed in the Wendigo, not really, but after that night, snowed in with only the storm and the distant howls for company, I don't laugh anymore. We'd been on this assignment for a week. I was one of the two rangers tasked with maintaining a remote outpost deep in the northern wilderness. Not the most glamorous job, but I'd always liked the isolation. There was a kind of peace to it, until there wasn't. The outpost sat about 30 miles from the nearest road, and once winter hit, the place was practically unreachable unless you had a snowmobile or a helicopter. Not that many people were clamoring to visit. It had been snowing for 3 days straight, the kind of storm that blocks out the sun and piles snow waist-deep in hours. I was holed up with my partner, Eric Gars, in the ranger cabin. A sturdy enough building, but with the wind howling outside and the snow slamming against the windows, it felt more like a fragile shelter than the safe haven it had always been before. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls, and the temperature inside kept dropping despite our best efforts to keep the stove going. The snowstorm had come in fast, quicker than the weather reports had predicted. We weren't worried, at least not at first. We had enough food and fuel to last the week, and the cabin was stocked with plenty of blankets and firewood. But by the second day, something about the storm felt wrong. The wind was fierce, stronger than I'd ever heard it. It wasn't just the sound, though. There was something in it, something that sounded like a voice. It was subtle at first, easy to write off as nothing more than the wind playing tricks on us. But that evening, as we sat by the fire, eating canned soup and trying to drown out the storm with idle conversation, we heard something else. A knock. It was faint, but unmistakable. A deliberate, steady knock at the door. Eric and I froze, staring at each other across the small table. Neither of us spoke for a moment. It was impossible. No one could be out here, not in this storm. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes locked on the door. "Maybe it's the wind," he said, though I could tell he didn't believe it. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 slow, deliberate raps, like someone or something was waiting for us to answer. Eric stood up, grabbed the shotgun we always kept by the door, and motioned for me to stay back. He crossed the room in a few long strides, his boots thudding against the wooden floor, and paused just before the door. I could see his breath clouding in the cold air, the temperature dropping fast. "Who's there?" Eric called out, his voice steady but tense. No answer, just the sound of the wind howling outside. He glanced back at me, then unbolted the door and yanked it open. A gust of icy air blasted into the cabin, nearly snuffing out the fire. But there was no one there, just darkness, snow, and the endless scream of the wind. Eric shut the door and bolted it again, shaking his head. "There's no one out there," he said. "Must have been the storm messing with us." But I wasn't so sure. The knock had been too deliberate, too human. And then there were the tracks. The next morning, when the storm had died down just enough to make it outside, I stepped out to check the perimeter, mostly to put my mind at ease. The snow was deep, almost to my knees, and the cold bit at my skin even through my thick coat. As I made my way around the cabin, I noticed them, footprints, fresh ones. They led right up to the door and then away, disappearing into the trees. They were large, almost human-shaped, but something about them was wrong. The toes were elongated, and the prints were spaced too far apart, like whatever had made them was unnaturally tall. "Eric, you need to see this," I called out, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He came out, joining me by the door, his face pale as he took in the sight of the prints. "Jesus," he muttered, kneeling down to inspect them. "No one could have survived out here long enough to walk in this storm. Not unless—" He trailed off, and I knew what he was thinking. The Wendigo. A legend, sure, but one that had been whispered about by locals for generations. A creature said to wander the wilderness, starving, always looking for its next victim. Eric stood, brushing the snow off his gloves. "It's probably just some animal," he said, more to himself than to me. But we both knew no animal left tracks like that. That evening, the wind picked up again, and with it came that eerie, distant howl. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but as the night dragged on, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a wolf's howl. This was deeper, more guttural, almost like a human scream. We sat in silence by the fire, listening. Every now and then, the howl would stop, only to start again minutes later, closer this time. Eric kept glancing at the window, his fingers gripping the shotgun tighter. Neither of us wanted to say it, but we both knew whatever was out there was getting closer. And then came the knock again, louder this time, more urgent. Eric stood up, but I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. "Don't," I whispered. "Don't open the door." The knocking continued, more frantic now, and then we heard it, a voice. A human voice, barely audible through the thick walls of the cabin. "Help me," it said. "Please, let me in." It sounded like a man, weak, desperate, but something about the voice wasn't right. It was too flat, too emotionless. And then it said my name. "Please," the voice said again. "Let me in. I'm cold. I need help." I stared at Eric, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. No one should have known we were out here. We hadn't told anyone the exact location of the outpost, and there was no way someone could have survived the storm long enough to make it to our cabin. Eric tightened his grip on the shotgun, his face set in determination. "If someone's out there, we can't just leave them," he muttered, his voice low but firm. Before I could stop him, he moved toward the door. "No, Eric, don't—" I tried, but it was too late. He threw open the door, shotgun raised, ready to confront whatever, or whoever, was outside. But there was no one, just snow swirling in the wind. And the tracks, those same tracks, leading away into the trees. Eric stood there for a moment, staring out into the storm, before slamming the door shut. "This isn't right," he muttered, pacing the small cabin. "None of this is right." The rest of the night passed in agonizing silence, broken only by the wind and the occasional knock. Each time, we ignored it, and each time the voice would grow louder, more insistent. It called out to us by name, pleading, begging, but it never tried to force its way in. It just waited. Morning came, but the sky remained dark, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Eric didn't say a word as he stoked the fire and checked the stove. Neither of us mentioned the knocking, but it hung in the air between us like a shadow. We were both exhausted, running on little sleep and high alert, waiting for whatever was out there to make its move. By midday, the knocking stopped altogether. The storm began to ease, and for the first time in days, the wind died down. I went outside to check the tracks again, but they were gone, covered by the fresh snow. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there wasn't gone. It was just waiting. We stayed in the cabin for 2 more days, the sense of dread hanging over us like a cloud. Neither of us ventured far from the door, and we didn't speak much. Finally, when the storm cleared enough to make our way back, we packed up and left without looking back. To this day, I don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was just the wind, playing tricks on our minds after days of isolation, but deep down, I know it wasn't. Those tracks, that voice calling my name, there was something unnatural about it, something that still follows me, even now, when I'm far from those woods. Story 12. There's a unique kind of silence that only exists in the deep woods. It's the kind that makes you feel small, like the trees are ancient sentinels, watching your every move with quiet judgment. I used to love that stillness, the sense of being swallowed by nature. But after that camping trip, the silence of the woods doesn't comfort me anymore. Now it feels like a warning. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway with a few friends. We had planned it for months, just a small group, getting out of the city, away from the noise and stress. There were 4 of us, me, Alex, Jenna, and Tom. We'd all known each other for years, bonded by a shared love of hiking, camping, and spending time in the wild. We weren't inexperienced. We'd camped plenty of times before, so when we picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any well-trodden trails, none of us thought twice about it. The first day was perfect. We hiked for hours, deep into the woods where the trees grew thicker, and the air was so fresh it made your lungs feel clean. There was no sign of other people, which is exactly what we wanted. Total isolation, just the 4 of us and nature. We found a clearing near a small stream and set up camp. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with the sun filtering through the trees in that way that makes the whole world feel golden. By the time we had the tents up, the fire going, and dinner cooked, the sky had turned a deep indigo. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing, the flames casting dancing shadows around the campsite. The woods were alive with the sound of insects, the occasional owl hooting from somewhere in the trees, and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful. At least, it was at first. It started with a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible sound just beyond the light of the fire. It was subtle, but enough to catch my attention. A rustling in the bushes, like something was moving through the underbrush. I paused mid-sentence, my eyes flicking to the tree line, but saw nothing, just darkness. "You hear that?" I asked, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't freak anyone out. Alex looked at me, then over his shoulder into the woods. "Probably just a deer or something," he said, shrugging it off. "We're in their territory, after all." I nodded, but something about the sound had put me on edge. I'd tried to push it down, to shake it off as nerves or paranoia, but after that I couldn't relax. Every time I glanced into the dark, I felt that same unease, like something was watching us. I didn't say anything more, though. No one else seemed bothered, so I figured it was just me. We stayed up late that night, telling stories and drinking a little, the way we always did on these trips. Eventually, the fire burned low, and one by one, we started drifting off to bed. I was the last one awake, sitting by the fire and staring into the embers, lost in thought. The woods had gone quiet again, the way they do when night fully takes over, and I was just about to crawl into my tent when I heard it again. The rustling, louder this time, closer. I froze, straining to hear. It wasn't a deer. The sound was too deliberate, too heavy, like something big was moving just beyond the circle of light. I grabbed the flashlight next to me and shined it toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, but all I could see were the tall trunks of the pines and the dense undergrowth at their base. No movement, no glowing eyes reflecting the light back at me. Nothing, but the feeling, that awful crawling sensation that something was out there, stayed with me. I stood there for a while, flashlight in hand, listening, waiting for the sound to come again. It didn't. After what felt like forever, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and turned off the light. The embers of the fire flickered weakly as I climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight, as if that thin layer of fabric would keep out whatever was lurking in the woods. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time the wind rustled the leaves or a branch snapped in the distance, my heart would race, my mind imagining all kinds of things creeping just outside our camp. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to complete silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that makes your skin prickle with tension. No wind, no insects, nothing. It was as if the entire forest had been muted. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the top of the tent, my breath shallow. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I was too afraid of what I might hear if I did. And then, there it was. Footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. They weren't far off, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the tents, moving through the brush. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, straining to hear anything that might give me a clue as to what it was. It didn't sound like a person. The footsteps were too heavy, too irregular, like something walking on two legs, but not quite human. My mind raced through the possibilities. Bear, maybe, but no, bears don't move like that. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to be a dream, hoping that if I stayed still long enough, it would go away. Then, the footsteps stopped, right outside the camp. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the sound to come again. But there was nothing, just that awful, deafening silence. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the footsteps started again. But this time, they were moving away, back into the woods, fading into the distance, until there was nothing left but the quiet rustling of the leaves. I don't know how long I lay there, too afraid to move, but eventually, exhaustion overtook me again, and I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, the sun was rising, casting soft golden light across the camp. I stumbled out of my tent, bleary-eyed and shaken, but I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to sound like a crazy person. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But when Jenna came out of her tent, her face pale and her eyes wide, I knew I hadn't been the only one to hear it. "Did you hear that last night?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, and we exchanged a look, one of mutual understanding, though neither of us wanted to say the words. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't just our imaginations. Alex and Tom were oblivious. They laughed and joked as they packed up their gear, talking about what hike we should do that day. Jenna and I shared a glance, but we kept quiet. No point in freaking them out, especially if it was nothing. But that day, the woods felt different. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound sharper. The trees felt like they were watching us, their branches whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. Jenna stuck close to me, and I noticed her glancing over her shoulder more than once. I was doing the same, though I tried not to make it obvious. As the day wore on, the tension didn't ease. If anything, it grew worse. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, just a flash of shadow between the trees. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. I wasn't the only one. Jenna saw it too. By the time we made it back to camp, The sun was already setting, and the unease from the night before had returned with full force. We built up the fire again, but it didn't feel like enough. The woods were darker than they had any right to be, and every crackle of the fire seemed to be swallowed by the silence beyond. As we sat there, I noticed something else. The sounds of the forest, the normal ones, the ones that should have been comforting, were gone. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals, just silence, the same oppressive silence from the night before. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight, something moved. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, standing upright like a person, but covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes reflected the firelight, yellow and glowing, watching us from the shadows. I blinked, hoping I was seeing things, but it was still there, motionless, staring. I nudged Jenna, and she followed my gaze. Her breath caught in her throat, and she froze. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, barely moving her lips. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't take my eyes off it, too terrified to speak, too terrified to move. And then, just as silently as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. We didn't sleep that night. None of us did. Story 13. There are places in the wilderness where silence isn't peaceful. It's suffocating. It presses in from all sides, making your heart race, even though you can't see anything threatening. That's how it felt the night I camped alone by the lake. What started as a peaceful escape into nature quickly turned into a terrifying encounter with something I still struggle to explain. I had been craving solitude, the kind you can only find miles away from civilization. So I packed up my gear and headed to a remote lake deep in the woods, a place I'd camped at a few times before. It was off the beaten path, known only to a handful of locals and die-hard outdoor enthusiasts. The kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows over the water. The lake was beautiful, its surface glassy and still, reflecting the orange and purple hues of the setting sun. I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I set up my tent near the shore, close enough to hear the gentle lap of the water. This was what I had come for: quiet, nature, and time alone to clear my head. I built a small fire, made some dinner, and sat by the water, watching as the last traces of daylight faded from the sky. The air was crisp but not cold, and there was no wind, just the stillness of the lake and the woods surrounding it. As the stars began to dot the sky, I leaned back against a log, letting myself relax. There were no sounds of traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as the night deepened, that comforting quiet began to change. It wasn't sudden, it was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The frogs that had been croaking along the shore stopped. The insects that buzzed around the fire went silent. Even the gentle breeze that had been stirring the trees seemed to vanish, leaving the air unnervingly still. I sat up, my senses suddenly alert. It was the kind of silence that wasn't natural, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I looked around, but there was nothing out of place. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the trees, but beyond that, everything was dark. Then I heard it, a splash in the water, not far from the shore. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the lake. It wasn't the soft sound of a fish jumping. It was bigger, heavier, like something large had moved through the water. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the lake's surface. For a moment, the water shimmered under the light, calm and undisturbed. But then I saw it, ripples, about 20 yards out, spreading in concentric circles, as if something had just broken the surface. I strained my eyes, trying to see what had caused it, but there was nothing. No movement, no shapes, just the slowly fading ripples. I told myself it was probably just a large fish, or maybe even a beaver, but my gut told me otherwise. Trying to shake off the unease, I threw another log on the fire, watching the sparks fly up into the night sky. The silence persisted, heavy and unnatural, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself I was overreacting, that spending too much time alone in the woods could mess with your head. But deep down, I knew something was off. I decided to head into my tent, hoping that some sleep would calm my nerves. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, leaving the flap of the tent open just enough to see the fire outside. The embers glowed softly, casting a dim light over the campsite. But even inside the tent, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. Lying there in the dark, I heard it again. A splash. Louder this time, closer. I sat up, my heart racing. Grabbing the flashlight, I crawled out of the tent and pointed the beam toward the lake. The water was rippling again, but this time the disturbance was much closer to shore, maybe 10 yards out. My pulse quickened as I scanned the surface, expecting to see an animal or maybe a large branch drifting in the water, but there was nothing, just the ripples, spreading outward in the dark. And then I saw it. At the edge of the light, something broke the surface of the water. At first, I thought it was a log, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It was dark, almost black, and long, with what looked like wet fur or hair clinging to it. It rose just above the waterline, and then something else appeared, eyes glowing faintly in the reflection of the flashlight. I froze. Those eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, cold. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent, calculating, watching me from just beneath the surface of the lake. For a moment, neither of us moved. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Then, slowly, it began to sink back into the water, the ripples spreading out in widening circles until the lake was still again. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know what I had just seen, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away from the lake. I grabbed my pack, throwing everything I could reach inside, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it up. The fire was still burning low, casting just enough light to see what I was doing, but every time I glanced at the water, I half expected to see those glowing eyes watching me from the shore. I told myself I just needed to get back to the car. It wasn't far, just a half-hour hike through the woods. I could make it. I would make it. With my pack slung over my shoulder, I kicked dirt over the fire, dousing the flames. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. Another splash. This time it was even closer, almost at the shore. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I started walking, then running, my boots crunching over the dried leaves and twigs as I made my way toward the trail. The trees loomed overhead, their branches casting long, twisted shadows in the moonlight. Every step I took, I felt like something was right behind me, following, watching. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the woods were empty, the lake hidden behind the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in the water wasn't far behind. My breath came in ragged bursts, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder, faster. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, the woods darker, more oppressive. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, my pulse pounding in my head, drowning out everything else. But then, just as I was starting to think I had imagined the whole thing, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, wet footsteps, sloshing through the underbrush behind me. I didn't dare turn around, I just ran, my heart racing, my muscles screaming in protest. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, faster, matching my pace. They weren't human. There was something unnatural about the sound, something that made my skin crawl. I burst through the trees, finally spotting the faint outline of my car in the moonlight. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. I could still hear the footsteps closing in, relentless. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them in the dirt. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to pick them up, my fingers numb with fear. The footsteps were so close now, I could almost feel the presence behind me, looming, watching. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, everything was still. I sat there, gasping for breath, staring out into the darkness beyond the windshield. The woods were quiet again, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, from somewhere near the edge of the trees, I saw it. A figure, tall, dark, and dripping with water, standing just beyond the reach of the car's headlights. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with those same cold, glowing eyes. I floored the gas pedal, not daring to look back as I sped down the narrow dirt road, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the lake far behind me, the road stretching out into the safety of civilization. I never went back to that lake. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it wasn't something natural. Something was watching me from the water, and whatever it wasn't human. Story 14. There are moments that stick with you for life. Moments when you come face to face with something that doesn't fit into the world as you know it. Most people never have those moments. They live in comfortable bubbles, convinced that everything can be explained. But after what happened to me that day in the valley, I know better. There are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that can't be rationalized away, and I've seen one of them. It started as a typical day in the mountains. My friends and I, Ben, Ashley, and Kyle, had set out early in the morning to explore a valley we'd heard about from some other hikers. It was a bit off the beaten path, but that was part of the appeal. We weren't new to this. We'd been hiking together for years, and we were always looking for the next great spot, the next hidden gem. The valley was remote, miles from the nearest road, and we had to hike through dense forest to get there. But once we made it, it was worth every step. The valley opened up like something out of a postcard, with towering cliffs on either side and a river snaking its way through the middle. The air was cool and fresh, the only sounds the soft rush of water and the occasional bird call. It felt like we had the entire world to ourselves. We followed the river for a while, enjoying the peace and quiet, stopping every now and then to take in the view or snap a few photos. Around midday, we decided to take a break by the water, unpacking our lunches and stretching out on the grass. The sun was warm on our faces, the sky a perfect shade of blue. It was one of those days where everything feels right, where the stress of the world melts away and all that's left is the beauty of nature. But then, as we were finishing up our lunch, Ben noticed something strange. He was standing by the edge of the river, staring down at the ground, his brow furrowed. "Hey guys," he called out, his voice edged with confusion. "Come check this out." We all got up and wandered over to where he was standing. At first, I didn't see what he was looking at. The ground by the riverbank was soft and muddy, crisscrossed with the usual animal tracks, deer, maybe some raccoons. But then I saw it. Among the smaller prints was something else, something much larger, a footprint, a huge footprint. "What the hell?" Kyle muttered, crouching down for a closer look. The print was massive, easily twice the size of a human foot. It had 5 distinct toes, just like a person's. But it was wider, the arch deeper, and the depth of the print, it was like something incredibly heavy had stepped there, sinking deep into the mud. "Must be a bear," Ashley said, though her voice was shaky. "Right?" "No," Ben replied, shaking his head. "Bears have claws. Look, there are no claw marks. And it's too human-looking." We all stood there in stunned silence for a moment, staring down at the print. It was unsettling in a way that's hard to describe. Something about it just felt wrong, too big, too heavy, too deliberate. Kyle, always the practical one, shrugged it off. "Maybe it's just a weird distortion or something. Mud can do that, right? Make things look bigger than they are." But none of us really believed that. Still, we moved on, trying to brush it off. We kept walking along the river, but the atmosphere had changed. What had been a carefree, peaceful day now felt tense, as if the valley itself had shifted somehow. The silence, which had been comforting, now felt oppressive, like something was watching us from the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. About an hour later, we found more footprints. This time, there were several of them, spaced far apart as if whatever had made them had been walking with long, heavy strides. The prints led away from the river, toward the forest at the edge of the valley. Ben, who had been quiet for most of the hike, stopped and turned to us. "I don't like this," he said, his voice low. "Something about this place feels off." I felt it too, deep in my gut. But I didn't want to be the one to suggest turning back. I didn't want to admit that I was scared. "Let's just keep going a little longer," Kyle said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe we'll run into someone else, figure out what's going on." But as we walked, the valley seemed to grow more silent. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind had died down. Even the river, which had been bubbling along beside us, seemed quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then we heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a scream, but not the kind of scream you hear from an animal or a person. This was different. It was low and guttural, rising and falling in an unnatural way, echoing off the cliffs and filling the valley. It was the kind of sound that doesn't belong in the world, the kind that sends a primal jolt of fear through your body, telling you to run. We all stopped in our tracks, frozen in place. The scream came again, louder this time, closer. "What the hell is that?" Ashley whispered, her face pale. "I don't know," Ben said, his voice tight. "But we need to get out of here. Now." None of us argued. We turned and started walking quickly back the way we'd come, our eyes scanning the trees, our hearts pounding in our chests. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, like something was following us, just out of sight, waiting. The scream came again, this time from a different direction, as if whatever was making it was circling us, closing in. "Faster," Ben urged, and we broke into a jog, trying to put distance between us and whatever was out there. As we neared the river, I glanced back over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light, but then it moved. It was huge, towering over the trees, its body covered in dark, matted hair. Its arms were long, its shoulders broad, and its head was too big, too misshapen, like something that had never been fully human. It stood there just at the edge of the forest, watching us, and then it took a step forward. I turned and ran, my heart slamming against my ribs, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The others were right behind me, their footsteps pounding the ground, their breaths coming in sharp, panicked gasps. We didn't stop running until we were back in the denser part of the forest, the trees closing in around us. Only then did we slow down, collapsing against the nearest rocks, our lungs burning, our legs trembling. "What was that?" Ashley gasped, her eyes wide with fear. No one had an answer. We sat there, trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what we'd seen, but there was no making sense of it. Whatever it wasn't an animal. It wasn't a bear, or a person, or anything we could explain. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. After a while, we gathered ourselves and hiked back in silence, the atmosphere thick with tension. None of us spoke about the creature, but I knew we were all thinking the same thing. We had seen something impossible, something that didn't belong in our world. When we finally made it back to the trailhead and piled into the car, the weight of what we'd experienced settled over us like a shroud. As we drove away, leaving the valley behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching us, waiting. I haven't gone back to that valley since. I don't think I ever will. There are places in the world that aren't meant to be explored, places where things lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. And now I know that sometimes, when you venture too far into the wild stares back, and what it shows you will haunt you forever. Story 15. There's something about the woods at night that makes everything seem just a little too close. The trees crowd in, the shadows stretch out, and every sound feels like it's crawling along the back of your neck. I'd hunted in these woods for years, always loved the solitude of it, the thrill of being out there alone. But this night, something was different, something I couldn't put my finger on until it was too late. The day had started like any other. My buddy Matt and I had set out in the early afternoon. Intending to camp overnight and hunt at dawn, we'd chosen a remote spot deep in the forest, miles from any trail or road, a place few people bothered to go. It was perfect for hunting, isolated, dense and untouched, just the way we liked it. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. We set up camp quickly, eager to settle in before the darkness swallowed the woods completely. The fire crackled softly, throwing flickers of light across the clearing, and for a while we sat in comfortable silence, the night creeping in around us. It wasn't until later, when the fire had burned down to embers and the cold had started to set in, that I noticed the quiet, too quiet. No wind rustling the trees, no crickets or nightbirds. Just the crackling of the dying fire and the steady thump of my heart in my chest. I didn't say anything at first, just sat there, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that the woods sometimes get like that, but deep down, I knew something was off. Matt must have noticed it too, because after a while, he glanced over at me, his brow furrowed. "You hear that?" I nodded, even though there was nothing to hear. "Or, you mean you don't hear anything?" "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "It's weird, right?" We sat there for a few more minutes, both of us staring into the darkness, listening to the absence of sound. It was unsettling, but not enough to send us packing. We were used to the woods, used to the eerie silences and strange sounds, but this was different. Finally, Matt stood up, brushing off his hands. "I'm gonna take a piss," he said, heading toward the trees. "Don't let the fire die." I watched him disappear into the shadows, the light from the fire barely illuminating the edge of the clearing. I grabbed a few more logs and tossed them onto the fire, watching as the flames jumped back to life, casting long, dancing shadows over the trees. That's when I heard it, a sound, faint at first, almost like the wind, but lower. A distant wail, rising and falling, like the cry of an animal but distorted, unnatural. I froze, my hand halfway to the fire, my ears straining to pick up the sound again. It came again, closer this time. A long, mournful howl that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. I knew those sounds. This was something else, something that didn't belong in these woods. "Matt!" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. No answer. I stood up, scanning the edge of the clearing, my heart beginning to race. The howl came again, even closer now, and I realized it wasn't coming from the direction Matt had gone. It was coming from behind me, deeper in the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, shining the beam into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all I could see were the trunks of the pines, standing tall and still like sentinels. The howl came again, this time from the direction Matt had gone, and that's when I heard something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. "Matt!" I shouted, fear creeping into my voice now. Still no answer. I turned toward the sound of the footsteps, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The beam bounced off the trees, casting eerie shadows that made my heart race even faster. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then they stopped. Silence. That oppressive, suffocating silence. I stood there, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire crackled softly behind me, but the woods were deathly still. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight, something moved. At first, I thought it was Matt. Relief washed over me, and I took a step forward, the words already forming on my lips. But then it stepped into the light. It wasn't Matt. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The thing was tall, towering over the underbrush, its body gaunt and twisted, its limbs too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost grey, stretched tight over its bones, and its face, God, its face. It was hollow, sunken, with eyes that glowed faintly in the firelight. Its mouth hung open, a dark, gaping hole, and from deep within its throat came that awful, guttural howl. I froze, unable to move, my body paralyzed with fear. The creature stood there watching me, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but my legs wouldn't listen. And then it took a step forward. The spell broke. I turned and ran, my legs finally responding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to get away from whatever that thing was. I sprinted through the woods, the flashlight bouncing in my hand, casting wild beams of light through the trees. Behind me, I could hear the creature moving, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, but somehow impossibly fast. It was following me, closing the distance with every step. I didn't dare look back. I crashed through the underbrush, branches slapping at my face and arms, my breath coming in painful, panicked bursts. The footsteps were right behind me now, almost on top of me, and I knew I couldn't outrun it. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I kept running, kept pushing forward. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, when the terror and exhaustion had finally overwhelmed me, I burst out of the trees and into another clearing. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for air, my eyes darting around wildly, searching for any sign of safety. And then I saw Matt. He was standing in the middle of the clearing, his back to me, his body completely still. "Matt!" I shouted, relief flooding through me. I took a step toward him, but something stopped me. Something was wrong. Matt didn't move, he didn't turn around, he just stood there, his body rigid, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he were listening to something. "Matt!" I called out again, my voice shaking. Slowly, he turned to face me. My stomach dropped. It wasn't Matt anymore. His eyes were blank, wide open, but vacant, as if he were staring right through me. His mouth hung open, slack and unnatural, and from deep within his throat came that same low, guttural howl. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my chest. No, no! But it wasn't Matt anymore. It was something else, something that had taken him. The last thing I remember before the world went dark was that awful howl echoing through the trees as the creature stepped out of the shadows and closed in on me. I woke up hours later, lying in the cold grass of the clearing, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. My body ached, my head pounded, and my mind was a blur of confusion and terror. Matt was gone. There was no sign of him, no sign of the creature, just the quiet, empty woods. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it, but one thing is certain, I'll never go back into those woods, not alone. Not ever. Story 16. There are places in the world where the line between reality and nightmare blurs, where you can feel something ancient and wrong lurking just beyond your sight. I thought I knew the woods. I thought I knew what was out there, that nothing could surprise me. But the night I spent in that cabin, alone with the sounds outside, shattered everything I thought I understood about the world. There are things out there that we can't explain. Things that will haunt you long after you've left the woods behind. It had been a routine assignment, a few nights out at the ranger station, monitoring the forest for poachers or lost hikers. I was used to the solitude. In fact, I craved it. The isolation of the woods was usually a welcome break from the chaos of everyday life. No phone service, no people, just me and the quiet hum of the forest. The ranger cabin sat in the middle of a thick forest, miles away from the nearest road. It was small but comfortable, just enough space for a bed, a wood stove, and a radio to check in with the main station. I had done this many times before, and every time it felt like a retreat. The only company I expected were the animals that sometimes wandered too close, or the occasional hiker who'd gotten themselves lost. But from the moment I arrived, Something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The woods seemed normal enough, the usual canopy of towering trees, the thick underbrush, and the distant sounds of birds and rustling leaves. But there was an uneasiness that settled in the pit of my stomach as I parked the truck and grabbed my gear. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I chalked it up to a long drive and a restless night of sleep the night before, telling myself I'd feel better once I got settled. I spent the first couple of hours setting up inside the cabin, unpacking my gear, and making sure the radio was working. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees, and I started a fire in the wood stove to take the chill out of the air. The crackling of the fire helped ease some of the tension, the warmth filling the small space, and for a while I let myself relax. But as the night closed in, the sense of unease returned, stronger this time. The usual sounds of the forest, the wind in the trees, the rustle of small animals seemed to fade away. The woods outside grew unnervingly quiet. I stood by the window, looking out into the darkness, but there was nothing to see, just the vague shapes of trees in the fading light. As the hours ticked by, the quiet became oppressive. It was the kind of silence that made the skin on the back of your neck prickle, the kind that felt like the forest was listening, watching. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just another night in the woods. But that instinct, the one that told me something wasn't right, wouldn't go away. I decided to step outside, thinking maybe some fresh air would help clear my head. The moment I opened the cabin door, the cold hit me, biting and sharp, far colder than it had been when I arrived. I stood on the small porch, looking out into the trees, but the darkness seemed impenetrable. My flashlight barely cut through it, illuminating only the nearest trunks and branches. Then I heard it, a sound, faint at first, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. It was hard to describe, halfway between a growl and a moan, low and guttural, like the earth itself was groaning. It sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard plenty of animals in these woods, bears, coyotes, even the occasional mountain lion. But this was different. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It sounded wrong. I stood frozen, listening as the sound came again, closer this time. It was deliberate, like something was moving through the trees, making its way toward the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest, and I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself. The sound came again, and this time I could hear something else. Footsteps, slow, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. Whatever it was big, too big to be anything I'd ever encountered out here. I backed up slowly, reaching for the door handle without taking my eyes off the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could feel my pulse in my throat as I fumbled to get back inside. Just as I was about to close the door, I caught a glimpse of movement, something large and dark moving between the trees. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart racing. I stood there, listening, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It was too dark to make out details, but whatever it was tall, taller than any man, and its movements had been unnaturally smooth, almost gliding between the trees. For a while, I just stood there, listening to the silence, hoping it was over. But then the sound came again, even closer now, the low growl, the heavy footsteps. Whatever it was right outside the cabin. I grabbed the rifle from the rack by the door, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I was up against, but I wasn't about to sit there and wait for it to come crashing through the door. I could hear it now, moving slowly around the cabin, circling. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, like it was taking its time, inspecting the place, deciding what to do next. I stood in the middle of the room, every muscle in my body tense, the rifle aimed at the door. I could hear the creaking of the wood on the porch, the slow, deliberate sound of something stepping up onto the cabin steps. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Just that unbearable silence. I held my breath, waiting, praying that whatever it was would leave, that it would go back into the woods and disappear. And then it knocked. It was a sound I'll never forget. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, heavy and solid, like something with immense strength was standing right outside, waiting to be let in. The sound reverberated through the cabin, rattling the walls, and for a moment I thought my heart was going to stop. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door, waiting for it to come crashing in. But it didn't. The knocking stopped, and once again the silence returned. For hours I stood there, rifle in hand, listening. The footsteps eventually faded, retreating into the woods, and the quiet of the forest settled back in. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting. When morning finally came, the first light of dawn creeping through the windows, I ventured outside. The air was cold and still, the forest eerily quiet. I walked around the cabin, rifle at the ready, but there was no sign of anything unusual, no footprints, no broken branches. Nothing to suggest that anything had been there at all. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd felt. Something had been out there that night, something that didn't belong in the world I understood. I didn't stay another night. I packed up my gear, locked the cabin, and hiked back to my truck, my senses on high alert the entire way. The woods were quiet, too quiet, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my heart racing. But I didn't see it again. Whatever had come to the cabin that night had gone, back into the darkness from where it had come. I've thought about that night a lot since then, replayed every sound, every moment in my mind, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how many times I go over it, I can't explain it. There are things out there, things we can't understand, things that watch us from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known, and I'm never going back to that cabin again. Story 17. The howl that pierced the night wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote, wasn't any animal I could identify. And in my 15 years as a forest ranger, I thought I'd heard them all. I was on my usual night patrol of Blackwood National Forest, a sprawling wilderness of dense pine and rugged terrain. The moon hung full and bright, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It was a quiet night, the kind where you could hear a pine needle drop a mile away. That's when it hit me, that bone-chilling howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze in my tracks, my flashlight beam dancing nervously across the underbrush. My heart raced as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source. Silence. Then another howl, closer this time. It was deep, guttural, almost human, but not quite. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. In all my years in these woods, I'd never encountered anything like this. I radioed back to base. "This is Ranger Mike. I'm hearing some strange noises out here. Going to investigate. Over." "I copy that, Mike. Be careful out there." "Over." I clicked off the radio and took a deep breath. Part of me wanted to turn tail and head back to the ranger station. But curiosity and duty won out. If there was something out here, something that could pose a danger to hikers or campers, I needed to know. I moved cautiously through the trees, my boots crunching softly on the carpet of pine needles. The forest seemed to close in around me, shadows deepening with each step. I swept my flashlight back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I saw them, the tracks. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down to examine them. They were huge, easily twice the size of my hand. 5 toes, like a bear, but the shape was all wrong. Too elongated, almost like a human foot, but massive. And the stride length, whatever made these was big, really big. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my mind racing. What the hell could have made these? A bear with some kind of deformity, some undiscovered species. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations, but a primal fear was creeping in, whispering of things that shouldn't exist. I followed the tracks, my curiosity overriding my better judgment. They led deeper into the forest, away from the main trails. The undergrowth grew thicker, branches clawing at my jacket. I had to use my free hand to push them aside, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. That's when I noticed the broken branches, not just on the ground, but high up, 7, 8 feet in the air. Something big had passed through here, something tall. My mouth went dry as I imagined what kind of creature could leave a trail like this. I pressed on, the forest growing denser with each step. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy now, leaving me dependent on my flashlight. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my footsteps and my increasingly ragged breathing. Suddenly, I caught a whiff of something that made me gag. It was a rank, musky odor like wet dog mixed with rotting meat. It grew stronger as I moved forward, and I had to fight the urge to cover my nose. Whatever I was tracking, I was getting close. The trees began to thin out, and I found myself on the edge of a small clearing. My flashlight beam swept across the open space, and that's when I saw it. My blood ran cold. In the center of the clearing stood a crude structure, like a lean-to made of broken branches and foliage, but it was the size that shocked me. It had to be at least 10 feet tall. No human could have built this, at least not without heavy equipment. And out here, miles from any road, I approached cautiously, my every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The stench was overwhelming now. As I got closer, I could see odd markings on the trees surrounding the structure, deep gouges in the bark, like claw marks, but larger than any bear could make. My hand shook as I reached out to touch one of the marks. The wood was splintered and raw. These cuts were fresh. Whatever made them could still be nearby. That's when I felt it, an overwhelming sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine. Slowly, I turned around, sweeping my flashlight across the tree line. 2 eyes reflected the light, glowing an eerie yellow-green. They were high up, at least 8 feet off the ground, and they were fixed directly on me. I stood paralyzed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The eyes blinked, and I caught a glimpse of a massive, shadowy form. It was vaguely humanoid, but much, much larger, covered in what looked like thick, matted fur. For a moment, we stared at each other, predator and prey locked in a primal standoff. Then it let out a low, rumbling growl that I felt in my bones. That broke the spell. I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear it behind me, moving with incredible speed for something so large. Trees shook and branches snapped as it gave chase. I ran blindly, my only thought to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. I lost all sense of direction, of time, of everything except the need to escape. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, I burst out onto one of the main trails. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock the door. I threw myself inside and locked the doors, gasping for breath. For a long moment, I just sat there, trembling, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing, just the usual nighttime sounds of the forest. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I tried to process what I'd seen. It couldn't be real, could it? Some part of my mind tried to rationalize it. A bear standing on its hind legs, a trick of the light and shadows, but I knew deep down that wasn't true. What I'd seen was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. I started the truck and headed back to the ranger station, my mind reeling. What was I going to put in my report? Who would believe me? As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes following me. When I reached the station, I sat in the parking lot for a long time, trying to decide what to do. In the end, I went inside and filed a routine report. Strange noises heard in Sector 7. Possible large predator sighted. Area should be monitored. I said nothing about the tracks, the structure, or the creature I'd seen. Who would believe me anyway? I'd be laughed out of the service, maybe even lose my job. And part of me didn't want to believe it myself. It was easier to try and forget, to convince myself it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But in the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, that growl. I found myself jumping at shadows, seeing movement in the corner of my eye. I requested a transfer to day shifts, claiming I needed a change of pace. My colleagues noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched at unexpected noises. They chalked it up to stress, maybe a bit of burnout. I never went back to that part of the forest, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that howl again, drifting over the trees. And I wonder what's out there, lurking in the shadows of Blackwood Forest, waiting to be discovered. Or maybe, hoping never to be found at all. Story 18, the scratching sound outside our tent was subtle at first, barely audible over the crackling of our dying campfire. But as the night wore on, it grew more insistent, more deliberate. That's when I knew this camping trip was about to become a nightmare. My name's Sarah, and I've been an avid camper since I was a kid. I thought I'd seen it all. Bears, mountain lions, you name it. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in the Cascade Mountains. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my boyfriend, Mike, and our friends, Jess and Tom. We'd hiked deep into the backcountry, far from the usual tourist spots. The scenery was breathtaking, towering pines, crystal-clear streams, and not another soul for miles. Perfect, or so we thought. We set up camp in a small clearing, the kind of idyllic spot you see on postcards. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The stars came out, more than I'd ever seen, blanketing the sky in a dazzling display. It was magical. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling sound in the distance. At first, we thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear, and probably just an avalanche on one of the distant peaks, Tom suggested, always the rational one. We shrugged it off and turned in for the night, Jess and Tom in one tent, Mike and I in the other. I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when the scratching started. It was faint at first, like branches brushing against nylon, but it grew louder, more rhythmic. I nudged Mike awake. "Oh, do you hear that?" I whispered. He listened for a moment, then nodded, his face a mask of concern in the dim light of our lantern. The scratching continued, moving around the perimeter of our tent. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a raccoon or any other small forest creature. "Maybe it's a bear," Mike whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew bears didn't behave like this. Suddenly, a shadow fell across our tent. Something large was standing between us and the moonlight. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The scratching stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural breathing. It sounded almost human but distorted, as if coming from a much larger chest cavity. Mike reached for the zipper of our tent, but I grabbed his arm, shaking my head frantically. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to face it. We sat in terrified silence, barely daring to breathe. After what seemed like an eternity, the shadow moved away, and we heard heavy footsteps retreating into the forest. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. We lay there, straining our ears for any sound of the creature's return. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we cautiously unzipped the tent and peered out. The clearing looked normal at first glance, but as we stepped out, we noticed things were off. Our camping chairs had been knocked over. The cooler was several feet from where we'd left it, its lid hanging open. But it was the footprints that made my blood run cold. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own feet, 5 toes, like a human print, but the shape was all wrong, too elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. And they were everywhere, circling our tents, leading to and from the tree line. "What the hell?" Tom exclaimed, emerging from his tent and seeing the prints. Jess followed, her face pale. "Did you guys hear anything last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They exchanged a glance. "We thought we were imagining things," Jess said quietly. "There was this breathing sound, and something big moving around." We spent the next hour examining the campsite, trying to make sense of what had happened. Our food supplies had been raided, but not in the way a bear would do it. Packages were opened almost delicately, as if by hands rather than claws. "Look at this," Mike called out. He was standing by a tall pine at the edge of the clearing. As we gathered around, he pointed up. About 8 feet off the ground, deep claw marks scored the bark. Whatever had made them had to have been standing upright, and it was tall, very tall. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the shadow that had loomed over our tent. Just how big was this thing? "We need to get out of here," Tom said, voicing what we were all thinking. We packed up camp in record time, constantly glancing over our shoulders at the surrounding forest. The cheerful birdsong and sunlight filtering through the trees felt like a mockery of the terror we'd experienced during the night. As we shouldered our backpacks, ready to hit the trail, Jess let out a gasp. "Guys, look!" She was pointing at Tom's GoPro, which he'd set up on a tree stump to capture some night sky footage. In our haste to leave, we'd almost forgotten about it. With shaking hands, Tom retrieved the camera and we huddled around its small screen, rewinding the footage. Most of it was just stars wheeling across the sky, but then a dark shape moved at the edge of the frame. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like thick, matted fur. It moved with an odd gait, not quite human, not quite animal. The creature paused, seeming to sniff the air, then turned towards the camera. We all gasped. Its face was a nightmare, vaguely human in structure, but with a protruding snout and eyes that glowed in the infrared light of the camera. It bared its teeth, long, sharp canines that no human mouth should possess. The creature moved closer to the camera, its breath fogging the lens. Then, with a swipe of its massive hand, the footage cut to static. We stood in stunned silence, trying to process what we'd just seen. It defied explanation, defied reality itself. "We need to show this to someone," Mike said finally. "The rangers, the police, someone." But as we looked at each other, I could see the doubt in everyone's eyes. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of every office, branded as hoaxers or lunatics. Let's just get back to civilization," I said. We can decide what to do then." The hike back was tense, every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush making us jump. We moved as quickly as we could, driven by the irrational fear that the creature might still be out there, watching us. When we finally reached the trailhead and our car came into view, the relief was palpable. We threw our gear in the trunk and piled in, not even bothering to change out of our hiking clothes. As Mike started the engine, I glanced back at the forest one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw movement among the trees, a large, dark shape retreating into the shadows. But when I blinked, it was gone. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We had experienced something that defied explanation, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. In the days that followed, we debated what to do with the footage. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. The world wasn't ready for this kind of revelation, and honestly, neither were we. But that night changed us. We never went camping again. At least not in the backcountry. The wonder and beauty of the wilderness had been forever tainted by fear of what might be lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself watching that footage again. I analyze every frame, every pixel, looking for some rational explanation, but deep down, I know the truth. There are things out there, in the wild places of the world, that defy our understanding, things that perhaps we're not meant to understand. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear a distant, inhuman howl, It sends shivers down my spine, and I'm transported back to that night in the mountains, when the line between myth and reality blurred, and I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. I don't know what it was that visited our camp that night, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or something else entirely, but I do know this: the wilderness holds secrets, and some of them are better left undiscovered. Story 19. The moment I realized I was being hunted, my entire world shifted. The forest I knew like the back of my hand suddenly became alien and hostile. Every shadow concealed a threat, every rustle of leaves a potential attack. I, the seasoned hunter, had become the prey. My name's Jack, and I've been hunting these woods for over 3 decades. I know every trail, every creek, every deer run, or at least I thought I did. That was before the day everything changed. It started like any other hunting trip. I'd taken a week off work, packed my gear, and headed deep into the Appalachian wilderness. My usual spot was a remote area, miles from the nearest road or campsite. Just me, the trees, and the wildlife. The first couple of days were uneventful. I saw plenty of deer sign, but hadn't taken a shot yet. I was in no hurry. Half the joy of hunting for me is just being out in nature, away from the noise and bustle of civilization. It was on the 3rd day that things started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a vague sense of unease, like I was being watched. I shrugged it off as paranoia. After all, I was alone in the wilderness. Of course, my senses were on high alert, but as I hiked to my favorite hunting blind, the feeling intensified. The forest seemed quieter than usual. No birdsong, no scurrying of small animals. It was as if the whole woods were holding its breath. I settled into my blind, a well-concealed spot overlooking a small clearing. As the hours ticked by, the silence grew oppressive. Not a single deer showed up, which was unusual for this area. By mid-afternoon, I decided to check my trail cameras. Maybe they'd caught something I'd missed. The first camera was right where I'd left it, strapped to an old oak. I popped out the memory card and scrolled through the images on the camera's small screen. Mostly the usual: deer, raccoons, the occasional coyote. But the last image made my blood run cold. It was taken at night, the infrared sensor capturing a large, indistinct shape. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a bear, and standing upright. The image was blurry, but I could make out what looked like long arms and a vaguely human-like silhouette. But no human could be that size. My hands shook as I replaced the memory card. It had to be a mistake. A bear standing on its hind legs, maybe distorted by the camera angle. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I moved on to the next camera, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. But this one had been torn from the tree, its sturdy metal casing crushed like it was made of tinfoil. Claw marks scored the bark where it had been mounted. My heart pounding, I scanned the surrounding trees. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. I clutched my rifle tighter, its familiar weight providing little comfort. That's when I saw the tracks. How I'd missed them earlier, I'll never know. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boots, 5 toes like a human print, but elongated and ending in what looked like claw marks. They led right up to where I was standing and then circled around behind me. Panic gripped me. Whatever had left these tracks had been right here, possibly while I was sitting oblivious in my blind, and judging by the freshness of the prints, it wasn't long ago. I abandoned all pretense of hunting and started back toward my campsite. I needed to get out of these woods, fast. But as I hurried down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every few minutes, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle behind me, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there, just shadows and trees. I picked up my pace, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I neared my campsite, I caught a whiff of something that made me gag. It was a musky animal smell, but far stronger than anything I'd encountered before. Mixed with it was the unmistakable scent of decay. I broke into a run, no longer caring about stealth. As I burst into the clearing where I'd set up camp, I skidded to a halt. My tent was in tatters, my gear strewn about like a tornado had hit it. But it was the deer carcass that made my stomach lurch. I hadn't killed any deer this trip, but there, in the center of my destroyed camp, was a freshly killed buck. It had been torn apart, not by teeth and claws, but almost surgically, and arranged around it like some kind of grotesque offering were parts of the deer I'd taken last season, the antlers I'd kept as a trophy, strips of the tanned hide, even the jarred venison I'd brought as part of my supplies. This wasn't the work of any animal. This was deliberate, intelligent, and it was a message meant for me. I stood there, frozen in shock and terror. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but somehow both. I ran. Abandoning what was left of my gear, I just ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I could hear it behind me, moving with incredible speed for something so large. Trees shook and branches snapped in its wake. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. My mind raced with half-remembered stories and legends. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Wendigo, names I'd always scoffed at, secure in my knowledge of the natural world. But now, with that creature on my heels, I wasn't so sure anymore. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My legs were lead, my chest on fire, but terror kept me moving. Eventually, I burst out onto a dirt road. I could have wept with relief at this sign of civilization. I turned to look behind me, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the tree line, but there was nothing, just the silent, indifferent forest. Had I lost it, or was it just waiting, watching? I started walking along the road, my legs shaky, my mind reeling. As the adrenaline wore off, I tried to process what had happened. It all seemed so surreal. Part of me wanted to believe it was some kind of elaborate prank or a stress-induced hallucination, but I knew deep down that wasn't true. After what seemed like an eternity, I heard the rumble of an engine. An old pickup truck came into view, driven by a wizened old man who looked at me like I'd just dropped from the sky. "You all right, son?" he asked as he pulled up beside me. "And looks like you've seen a ghost." I must have been quite a sight, scratched up, wild-eyed, covered in dirt and sweat. I opened my mouth to explain, but where would I even begin? Who would believe me? Got a bit turned around. I managed to croak out, "Can you give me a lift to town?" He nodded, eyeing me suspiciously but gesturing for me to get in. As we drove, he kept glancing at me, clearly wanting to ask questions but holding back. Finally, he spoke. "You saw something out there, didn't you?" His tone was knowing, almost sympathetic. I looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" He sighed. "These woods, they've got secrets, things that most folks ain't ready to believe. Been that way for generations." I wanted to press him for more, but something in his expression stopped me. He knew, or at least suspected, what I'd encountered. But he also knew the burden of that knowledge. We rode the rest of the way in silence. When he dropped me off in town, he left me with a parting piece of advice. "Some things once seen can't be unseen. Best to leave 'em be." I never went back to retrieve my gear. Never went hunting in those woods again. The experience changed me profoundly. I find myself looking over my shoulder more often, especially in wild places. The line between predator and prey, I've learned, is thinner than we'd like to believe. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear that growl again, carried on the wind, and I wonder about what's out there, lurking in the dark corners of the world. Things that defy explanation, that challenge everything we think we know. I was a hunter once. Now, I'm not so sure. Because out there in those ancient forests, there are creatures that have been hunting since long before humans ever picked up a spear. And sometimes they decide it's time to remind us of our place in the natural order. Story 20. The night I saw it cross the road, my whole world turned upside down. One moment, I was just another tired trucker making a late-night haul. The next, I was questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name's Dave, and I've been driving big rigs for nearly 2 decades. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the lonely highways that crisscross this country, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered on that moonlit stretch of road in rural Oregon. It was a typical run, hauling produce from California up to Washington. I'd done this route 100 times before, could practically drive it with my eyes closed, not that I ever would, mind you. It was just past midnight, and I was making good time. The cab of my truck filled with the low hum of the engine and the crackling of the CB radio. The road wound through dense forest, towering pines creating a tunnel effect in my headlights. It was peaceful, in that eerie way that only nighttime driving can be. I was alone out there, just me and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out ahead. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a bear. We get plenty of those in these parts, and it wouldn't be the first time I'd seen one lumbering across the road. But as my headlights illuminated the figure, I realized this was something else entirely. It was tall, far taller than any bear I'd ever seen. Standing upright on 2 legs, it had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, dark as the night around it. But it was the way it moved that really got me. Smooth, almost graceful, like a person in a bulky coat. Except no person could ever be that big. As my truck barreled towards it, the creature turned its head to look at me. In that brief moment, illuminated by my high beams, I saw its face. It was almost human, but not quite. The brow was heavy, the jaw protruding, and its eyes, God, its eyes. They reflected the light like an animal's, but there was an intelligence there that sent a chill down my spine. In 2 long strides, it was across the road and into the forest on the other side. I slammed on the brakes, my trailer fishtailing behind me as I skidded to a stop. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white, heart pounding in my chest. What the hell had I just seen? I grabbed my flashlight and against my better judgment, climbed down from the cab. The forest was silent, eerily so. No cricket chirps, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the whole woods were holding its breath. I swept my flashlight across the road, half expecting to see nothing, to convince myself it had all been a trick of the light and my tired mind. But there, in the loose dirt on the shoulder, was a footprint, a huge footprint, easily twice the size of my own boot. 5 toes like a human print, but elongated and ending in what looked like claw marks. My blood ran cold. This was real. Whatever I'd seen, it wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal I could name. The word Bigfoot flashed through my mind, but I pushed it away. That was the stuff of tabloids and campfire stories, not something you actually saw on a dark Oregon highway. I climbed back into my truck, my hands shaking as I fired up the engine. As I pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see that massive shape emerge from the trees behind me. The rest of the drive was a blur. I white-knuckled it all the way to my destination, jumping at every shadow and movement in my peripheral vision. When I finally pulled into the depot in Washington, I was a wreck. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I'd be laughed off the job, branded as some kook who'd had one too many late-night energy drinks. But I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, that impossible silhouette in my headlights. It was a week later when I heard the first rumors. I was back home, having a beer at the local tavern, when I overheard a couple of hunters talking in hushed tones. "I'm telling you, something's out there," one of them was saying. "Found my deer stand all torn up last week. Claw marks 8 feet up the tree. No bear could have done that," his buddy scoffed. "You been dipping into the moonshine again, Bob?" But I could see the fear in Bob's eyes. He'd seen something too, or at least the aftermath of it. Over the next few months, more stories started to circulate. Hikers reporting strange noises in the woods. Campers finding their sites ransacked by something too intelligent to be a normal animal. And footprints, always those massive, humanoid footprints. The local paper ran a story about increased bear activity, warning people to be cautious in the backcountry. But those of us who had seen it, we knew better. This was something else entirely. I found myself obsessing over it. On my days off, I'd drive out to that stretch of highway, walking the woods nearby, looking for, I don't know what, signs, proof, closure. I never found anything definitive, but sometimes I'd catch a whiff of that musky animal scent, or hear a rustle in the underbrush that was just a little too deliberate to be a deer. One night, about 6 months after my encounter, I was parked at a rest stop along that same highway. It was a clear night, the moon full and bright. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd seen. That's when I heard it. A long, low howl that echoed through the trees. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote, it was something other. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt that same primal fear I'd experienced the night I saw the creature. The howl was answered by another, then another. 3 distinct voices, calling to each other across the forest. I sat there frozen as the howls went back and forth for several minutes before fading away into the night. In that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't just one creature. There was a whole population of them out there, hidden away in the vast wilderness. A species unknown to science, living right under our noses. The next day, I gave my notice at work. I couldn't keep driving that route, couldn't bear the tension of wondering if I'd see it again. I took a job closer to home, local routes that kept me out of those deep forests. But I can't forget what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself poring over maps of the area, marking sighting locations, trying to piece together the puzzle. I've connected with others who've had similar experiences, trading stories in hushed tones over beers or around campfires. We don't call it Bigfoot. That name seems too sensational, too tied up with hoaxes and blurry photos. We just call them the creatures, or sometimes the forest people, because whatever they are, they're intelligent. They've managed to stay hidden all this time, revealing themselves only on their own terms. I often wonder if I'll ever see one again. Part of me hopes I do, just for the validation, but another part, a deeper, more primal part, hopes I never have to face those knowing eyes again. Because out there in the wilderness, in the dark spaces between the trees, there are things that defy our understanding of the world, things that remind us that we're not at the top of the food chain, not really. And sometimes, just sometimes, they step out of the shadows to remind us of that fact. So if you're ever driving down a lonely highway at night and you see something big step out onto the road ahead of you, something that doesn't quite fit any animal you know, well, just remember, you're not crazy, you're not alone, and whatever you do, don't stop driving. Story 21. The moment I saw it through my camera lens, I knew my life would never be the same. 1 second I was just another wildlife photographer chasing the perfect shot, and the next I was face to face with something that shouldn't exist. My name is Alex, and I've been photographing wildlife for over a decade. I've captured images of some of the most elusive creatures on the planet, snow leopards in the Himalayas, jaguars in the Amazon, you name it. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment. A magazine had commissioned me to get some shots of the local wildlife for a feature on conservation efforts in the area. I'd spent weeks scouting locations, setting up camera traps, and waiting patiently in blinds for the perfect moment. That fateful day, I'd hiked deep into a remote area of the forest, far from any trails or campsites. I'd heard rumors of an unusually large bear in the area, and I was determined to get a shot of it. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in a golden glow, I settled into my hide, a carefully camouflaged shelter that allowed me to observe without being seen. Hours passed. The forest grew dark, and I switched to my night vision equipment. The sounds of the nocturnal forest surrounded me, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. I was just beginning to think about packing it in for the night when I heard it. A low, rumbling sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a howl. It sent shivers down my spine. I raised my camera, peering through the viewfinder into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then movement caught my eye. Something large was moving between the trees, just at the edge of my camera's range. I held my breath, finger poised over the shutter button. The creature stepped into a small clearing, and I nearly dropped my camera in shock. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall and covered in thick, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear. It was standing upright, on 2 legs, its silhouette unnervingly human-like. My mind raced. Bigfoot? Sasquatch? The rational part of my brain rejected the idea immediately. Those were myths, stories told around campfires. But as I watched the creature move with an almost human gait, I couldn't deny what I was seeing. I started snapping photos, the soft click of my camera's shutter sounding impossibly loud in the quiet forest. The creature paused, its head turning in my direction. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it had heard me. But then it continued on, disappearing back into the thick undergrowth. I sat there, trembling, for what felt like hours. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the photographer in me, the part that had always pushed me to get the shot no matter what, kept me rooted to the spot. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally worked up the courage to leave my hide. My legs were stiff from sitting still for so long, and my hands shook as I packed up my gear. I couldn't wait to get back to civilization and look at the photos I'd taken. Surely, in the light of day, there would be a rational explanation for what I'd seen. The hike back to my campsite was tense. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to conceal some lurking threat. When I finally reached my tent, I practically dove inside, zipping it up behind me as if that thin layer of nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. With shaking hands, I connected my camera to my laptop. As the images loaded, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, in crisp digital clarity, a massive, fur-covered figure standing upright among the trees. Its face was mostly obscured by shadow, but I could make out the outline of a heavy brow and a protruding jaw. And its eyes, even in the grainy night vision image, they seemed to glow with an eerie intelligence. I stared at the image for a long time, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax, a man in a suit, something. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. I had seen this creature with my own eyes, heard its call, watched it move through the forest with a grace that no human in a costume could replicate. As I flipped through the other images, a chill ran down my spine. In several of them, the creature appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Had it known I was there all along? Had it been posing for me? The sound of a branch snapping outside my tent made me jump. I held my breath, listening intently. There it was again, the soft crunch of footsteps on pine needles, circling my campsite. Something large was out there, moving with deliberate stealth. A low, rumbling vocalization filled the air, the same sound I'd heard the night before. It was close, so close I could hear deep, heavy breathing just outside my tent. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The forest fell silent again, save for the pounding of blood in my ears. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like hours, afraid to even breathe too loudly. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and peer outside, the campsite looked undisturbed, but there, pressed into the soft earth near my tent, was a footprint. A huge, humanoid footprint, easily twice the size of my own foot. I broke camp in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie down my gear. As I drove down the mountain, my mind raced. What was I going to do with these photos? Who would believe me? I'd seen the ridicule that other Bigfoot researchers faced. Did I want to subject myself to that? But I also knew I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. This was the discovery of a lifetime, possibly the most important zoological find in centuries. I had a responsibility to share it with the world. Over the next few weeks, I agonized over what to do. I pored over my photos, analyzing every pixel. I researched Bigfoot sightings and theories, falling down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and blurry videos. The more I learned, the more I realized how little we really knew. In the end, I decided to release just one photo, the clearest shot I had of the creature. I sent it to a reputable wildlife magazine, along with a carefully worded article describing my experience. I held back the most dramatic details, presenting it as a possible sighting of an unknown species, rather than definitive proof of Bigfoot. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My photo was plastered across news sites and social media. I was inundated with interview requests, offers from cryptozoology shows, even a few threats from people who thought I was trying to perpetrate a hoax. Some experts claimed it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. Others insisted it was a man in a suit. But a few, a respected primatologist, a forensic photo analyst, said that what they were seeing defied easy explanation. They couldn't say for sure what it was, but they also couldn't definitively say what it wasn't. As for me, I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that out there, in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, there are things that defy our understanding of the natural world, things that have managed to stay hidden, revealing themselves only on their own terms. I never went back to that specific spot in the forest, but I find myself drawn to similar areas, always with my camera in hand. Because now I know that the greatest discoveries don't always happen in labs or on expeditions. Sometimes they happen when you least expect it, in the quiet moments between breaths, in the shadows between the trees, and who knows, maybe someday I'll get that perfect shot, the one that proves, beyond any doubt, that we're not alone in these forests, that there are still mysteries out there waiting to be uncovered. Until then, I'll keep watching, keep listening, and keep my camera ready. Because in the end, that's what being a wildlife photographer is all about. Capturing the unseen, revealing the hidden wonders of our world, even if those wonders sometimes defy explanation. Story 22. The moment we stepped into that cave, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. The air changed, became heavy with a primal dread that set every nerve on edge. We'd come looking for adventure, but what we found was something far more ancient and terrifying than we could have ever imagined. My name's Mike, and I've been an avid hiker and amateur spelunker for years. My girlfriend Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months, a week-long trek through some of the most remote wilderness in the Appalachian Mountains. We'd heard rumors of an unmapped cave system in the area, and the prospect of exploring virgin territory was too tempting to pass up. We'd been hiking for 3 days when we found it. The entrance was half hidden behind a curtain of vines, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. As we pushed aside the greenery, a cool draft of air hit our faces, carrying with it a musty, earthy scent. "This is it," I said, unable to keep the excitement from my voice. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. We switched on our headlamps and ducked into the cave. The entrance was narrow, forcing us to squeeze through sideways. The walls were slick with moisture, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the darkness. As we moved deeper into the cave, the passage widened, opening into a large chamber. Our headlamps couldn't penetrate the full extent of the darkness. The ceiling soared above us, lost in shadow. "This is incredible," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe. I nodded, sweeping my light across the chamber. That's when I saw them, the markings. At first, I thought they were just natural formations in the rock, but as I moved closer, I realized they were deliberate. Crude symbols carved into the stone, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They weren't Native American pictographs or early settler graffiti. These were something else, entirely. "Sarah, come look at this," I called out. She made her way over, her brow furrowing as she examined the markings. What do you think they are? I shook my head. I have no idea, but they're old, really old. As we continued to explore the chamber, we found more of these strange symbols. They seemed to tell a story, though one we couldn't decipher. Figures that were almost but not quite human. Animals that didn't match any species I knew. And dominating it all, a large, looming shape that sent a chill down my spine. "Mike," Sarah said, her voice tight, "do you smell that?" I paused, sniffing the air. There was something beyond the usual cave mustiness, a rank animal odor that reminded me of a zoo on a hot day, but there was something else mixed in with it, something I couldn't quite place. It smelled like decay. "Maybe there's a dead animal deeper in the cave," I suggested, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Sarah nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "Maybe we should head back," she said. "It'll be getting dark soon." Part of me wanted to agree. The cave had taken on a menacing air, the shadows seeming to move in the corners of our vision, but my curiosity won out. "Just a little further," I said. "I want to see if there's another chamber." We pressed on, the passage narrowing again. The smell grew stronger, making us gag. The walls were slick with some kind of viscous substance that our lights couldn't quite penetrate. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the very rock around us. It wasn't the growl of any animal I knew. It was deeper, more primordial. We froze, our headlamps darting around wildly. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, we heard it again, closer this time, and with it, the sound of something moving, something big. "Run," I said, my voice hoarse with fear. We turned and fled, our footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow passage. I could hear Sarah's panicked breathing behind me, punctuated by the sound of whatever was pursuing us. As we burst back into the main chamber, I risked a glance back. In the swinging beam of my headlamp, I caught a glimpse of something that defied description. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in a thick, matted fur, but its face... God, its face. It was almost human, but twisted, elongated. Its eyes reflected the light of our lamps, glowing with an inhuman intelligence. I turned away, pulling Sarah along with me. We scrambled towards the entrance, our lungs burning, our hearts pounding. The creature's roar echoed through the cave, shaking loose small stones from the ceiling. We burst out of the cave entrance, tumbling to the ground. Without pausing to catch our breath, we scrambled to our feet and ran. We didn't stop running until we reached our campsite, collapsing by the embers of our morning fire. For a long time, we just sat there, gasping for air, unable to speak. The forest around us seemed impossibly quiet after the terror of the cave. What was that thing?" Sarah finally managed to say. I shook my head, still trying to process what I'd seen. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it." We broke camp in record time, our hands shaking as we packed our gear. Neither of us wanted to spend another night in these woods. As we hiked out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made us jump. It wasn't until we were back in civilization, sitting in a small-town diner with cups of hot coffee in front of us, that we really talked about what had happened. "We should report it," Sarah said, "to the park rangers or, I don't know, someone." I nodded slowly. "But who would believe us? We don't have any proof," and that was the crux of it. We had no evidence, no photos, nothing but our own terrified memories. Who would believe a story about a monster in a cave? In the days and weeks that followed, I pored over books and websites, searching for anything that might explain what we'd encountered. Bigfoot, Wendigo, some unknown species of primate, nothing quite fit. I found myself obsessing over those strange symbols we'd seen in the cave. What story were they telling? Was it a warning about the creature, or something else entirely? We never went back to that cave, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear that low, rumbling growl, and in my dreams I see those glowing eyes, that twisted face, I know now that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the dark places, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, and sometimes, if we're not careful, we stumble upon them. To this day, I can't look at a cave entrance without feeling a chill run down my spine. The wilderness holds secrets, ancient and terrible, and some of those secrets, I've learned, are best left undiscovered. But I can't forget what I saw in that cave, can't forget the smell, the sound, the sheer primal terror of that moment. It's changed me, changed how I see the world. Because now I know that just beyond the edge of our civilized world, just out of sight in the shadows, there are things that shouldn't exist. Things that have existed long before us, and will likely exist long after we're gone. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, you might just come face to face with one of them. So if you're ever hiking in the remote wilderness and you come across a cave that's not on any map, my advice is this: keep walking. Some doors are best left unopened, some mysteries best left unsolved, because once you've seen what's on the other side, you can never unsee it, and that knowledge will haunt you for the rest of your days. Story 23. The day I found that tuft of fur, everything I thought I knew about biology went out the window. One moment I was a respected scientist. The next, I was questioning the very foundations of my field. And as I delved deeper into the mystery, I realized I might be putting my life on the line for the discovery of the century. My name is Dr. Eliza Thornton, and I've spent the last decade studying wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. I've tracked everything from wolves to mountain lions, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Olympic National Forest. It all started with reports from local hikers and campers. Strange noises in the night, glimpses of something large moving through the underbrush, and most intriguingly, footprints that didn't match any known species. Most of my colleagues dismissed these accounts as exaggerations or misidentifications, but something about the consistency of the reports caught my attention. I decided to mount an expedition. My university was skeptical, but I managed to secure a small grant and a team of 3 graduate students. We set out in early summer, when the forest was lush and teeming with life. Our first week in the field was uneventful. We set up camera traps, collected scat samples, and interviewed locals. But on the 8th day, everything changed. I was checking a camera trap we'd set up near a small stream when I noticed something caught on a nearby bush. At first glance, it looked like ordinary animal fur. But as I got closer, I realized it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The hair was coarse and thick, almost like horsehair, but much longer, and the color was odd, a reddish-brown that didn't match any of the local wildlife. I carefully collected the sample, my heart racing with excitement and trepidation. Back at our base camp, I examined the fur under a microscope. The structure was bizarre. It didn't match any known mammal species. The closest comparison I could make was to primate hair, but even that wasn't quite right. "What do you think it is, Dr. Thornton?" asked Lisa, one of my grad students. I shook my head, unable to take my eyes off the microscope. "I'm not sure, but whatever left this behind, it's big, and it's something we've never documented before." That night, as we sat around the campfire, the forest seemed different. Every shadow held the potential for mystery, every rustle in the underbrush a possible encounter with the unknown. We spent the next few days combing the area where I'd found the fur, looking for more evidence. And we found it: more hair samples, unusual scat, and most excitingly, footprints. The prints were enormous, easily twice the size of a human foot. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, but with subtle differences that ruled out a hoax. 5 toes, but the big toe was offset, almost like a thumb, and the depth of the impressions suggested something of considerable weight. As we catalogued our findings, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. More than once, I caught glimpses of movement just at the edge of my vision, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. On the 4th night after our initial discovery, we got our first real breakthrough. One of our camera traps had captured something extraordinary. The image was blurry, taken in low light, but it clearly showed a large, bipedal creature moving through the forest. It was covered in the same reddish-brown fur we'd found. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, and the way it moved, it was almost human, but not quite. "Holy shit," breathed Tom, another of my students. Is that Bigfoot?" I winced at the term. "Let's not jump to conclusions. This is clearly an unidentified species, but we need more evidence before we can make any claims." But privately, my mind was reeling. Could it be possible? Could there really be an undiscovered primate species living right here in the Pacific Northwest? We redoubled our efforts, setting up more cameras and spending long hours in observation blinds. And slowly, we began to build a picture of our mysterious creature. It was nocturnal, highly intelligent, and incredibly elusive. We found evidence of tool use, crude structures built from branches, stones that had clearly been used for cracking nuts. Whatever this species was, it was no mere animal. But as our evidence mounted, so did the strange occurrences around our camp. Equipment would go missing, only to turn up in odd places. We'd wake to find our food stores raided, even though they were secured in bear-proof containers, and the feeling of being watched intensified. One night, about 2 weeks into our expedition, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing just outside my tent. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it must be audible. A shadow fell across the tent wall. Something large was out there. I heard a low, rumbling vocalization unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was almost like speech, but no language I could identify. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the shadow moved away. I waited until dawn before emerging from my tent. What I found shook me to my core. Our camp had been methodically searched, not ransacked, but examined. Items had been moved, looked at, and carefully replaced. It was as if our mysterious creature had been studying us just as we'd been studying it. But the most chilling discovery was found on a large, flat stone near the center of our camp. Arranged with obvious purpose were the memory cards from our camera traps, every single one, our most valuable evidence, laid out like an offering or a warning. I gathered my team. "I think it's time we face facts," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "We're not dealing with an ordinary animal here. Whatever this species is, it's intelligent, self-aware, and it knows we're here." The gravity of our situation began to sink in. We weren't just making a scientific discovery. We were making first contact with an unknown, intelligent species. The implications were staggering. As we debated our next move, a realization hit me. "The memory cards," I said suddenly. "It left them for us. It knows about cameras, understands what they do. This species has been deliberately hiding from us for who knows how long." The question that hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all of us, was, what would it do now that it knew we knew about it? We decided to leave our most sensitive equipment running, but to withdraw to the edge of our research area. We needed to observe from a distance to see how our presence had affected the creature's behavior. Over the next few days, we caught fleeting glimpses of our subject. It seemed more bold now, less concerned with concealment. We captured more photos, more videos. Each one was groundbreaking. Each one defied everything we thought we knew about the wildlife in this area. But as our evidence grew, so did my unease. What would happen when we presented our findings to the world? How would this impact the creature's habitat, its way of life, and more pressingly, how would it react? On our final night in the field, as we prepared to return to civilization with our world-changing evidence, I heard that low, rumbling vocalization again. Closer this time, more deliberate. I stepped out of my tent, my heart in my throat. There, at the edge of our camp, stood the creature we'd been pursuing. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, its powerful body covered in that distinctive reddish-brown fur. But it was the eyes that struck me most. Intelligent, curious, and unmistakably aware. For a long moment, we regarded each other. Then, slowly, deliberately, it placed something on the ground. With one last look at me, it turned and disappeared into the forest. When I approached the spot, I found a small, crudely woven basket. Inside was a collection of local plants. Some I recognized as having medicinal properties. Others I'd never seen before. It was a gift, an exchange of knowledge. As I stood there, holding this offering from an unknown species, I realized the true weight of our discovery. We hadn't just found a new animal, we'd found a new people. A species as intelligent as our own, that had lived alongside us in secret for who knows how long. The implications were staggering. Every field of science would be upended. Our understanding of human evolution, of biology, of ecology, all of it would need to be rewritten. But more than that, we were faced with an ethical dilemma, unlike any in human history. How do we reveal this discovery without destroying the very thing we've found? How do we protect this species from the onslaught of media, tourists and poachers that would inevitably follow? As I packed up our camp for the last time, I knew that the real work was just beginning. We had uncovered a mystery as old as humanity itself, and in doing so, we'd changed the course of history. What we do with this knowledge will define not just our species, but our relationship with this new, incredible people we've discovered. The forest will never look the same to me again. Every shadow could hide a secret. Every unexplored valley could house wonders beyond our imagination. We've been given a glimpse behind the curtain of our world, and what we've seen is more incredible than we ever could have dreamed. Story 24. The moment I saw that massive shape glide beneath our boat, I knew this fishing trip was about to become the story of a lifetime. One second we were just 3 friends enjoying a peaceful day on the lake, and the next we were face to face with something that shouldn't exist. My name's Jake, and I've been fishing these waters since I was old enough to hold a rod. Lake Champlain has always been full of surprises, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that misty morning in late September. It was me, my buddy Mike, and his cousin Tom, who'd come up from the city for the weekend. We'd set out at dawn, the lake shrouded in a thick fog that made the world feel small and intimate. The water was like glass, our little boat leaving a widening V in our wake as we motored out to my favorite spot. "You sure there are fish out here, Jake?" Tom asked, peering dubiously into the murky water. "It looks pretty dead to me," I chuckled, cutting the engine as we reached the spot. "Trust me, city boy, this lake's full of life. You just gotta know where to look." If only I'd known how right I was. We settled in, casting our lines and enjoying the peaceful morning. The fog was starting to lift, revealing the green hills surrounding the lake. It was picture perfect, the kind of day that reminds you why you love fishing in the first place. That's when Mike spotted it. "Hey, guys," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "Check that out." He was pointing off the port side of the boat. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, a dark shape moved just beneath the surface. It was big, much bigger than any fish I'd ever seen in these waters. "What the hell is that?" Tom whispered, leaning over the side for a better look. The shape disappeared into deeper water, leaving barely a ripple. We all exchanged glances, a mixture of excitement and unease on our faces. "Maybe it was a sturgeon," I suggested, though I didn't really believe it. Sturgeon can get big, sure, but this was something else entirely. We kept fishing, but our attention was now focused on the water around us, searching for another glimpse of the mysterious creature. An hour passed with no sign of it. I was starting to think we'd imagined the whole thing when Tom's rod suddenly bent double. "I got something!" he yelled, grabbing the rod with both hands. "Jesus, it's strong!" Mike and I rushed to help, but before we could reach him, the line went slack. Tom reeled in, his face falling as he saw his hook was empty. "Damn," he muttered. "That thing hit like a freight train." I was about to commiserate when I saw it. The water about 20 yards from the boat began to churn. Something massive was rising to the surface. "Holy shit," Mike breathed. A head emerged from the water. At first glance, it looked almost like a horse's head, but much, much larger. Its neck was long and sinuous, rising a good 6 feet out of the water. But it was the eyes that really got me. They were huge, easily the size of dinner plates, and filled with an intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. For a moment, the creature regarded us silently. None of us dared move. Then it let out a bellow that shook the air around us. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between. "Start the engine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Start the engine now." Mike scrambled for the ignition, but before he could turn the key, the creature dove. The water exploded around it, rocking our little boat violently. We grabbed onto whatever we could to stay upright. "Where'd it go?" Tom yelled, his eyes wide with panic. We scanned the water, but the lake had gone still again. The silence was oppressive, broken only by our ragged breathing. Then we felt it. A bump against the bottom of the boat, strong enough to lift us slightly out of the water. Tom let out a yelp of fear. "Get us out of here!" he screamed. Mike finally got the engine started, and we took off across the lake at full speed. I looked back, half expecting to see the creature in pursuit, but there was nothing but our own wake. We didn't slow down until we reached the shore. As we tied up at the dock, our hands shaking, we tried to process what we'd just seen. What was that thing?" Tom asked, his face pale. I shook my head. "I don't know. I've been on this lake my whole life, and I've never seen anything like it." We gathered our gear in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we walked up to the parking lot, Mike suddenly stopped. "Guys," he said, pointing to the ground. "Da look." There, in the soft mud by the water's edge, was a footprint, but not like any footprint I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily 3 feet long, with what looked like webbed toes, and there wasn't just one. A whole trail of them led from the water into the dense underbrush nearby. "It came on land," I whispered, the implications hitting me like a truck. "Whatever that thing is, it can come on land." We followed the tracks to the edge of the forest, where they disappeared into the thick vegetation. The trees seemed to loom over us, suddenly menacing in the late morning light. "We need to report this," Mike said. "The authorities, scientists, someone needs to know about this." I nodded slowly, but a part of me hesitated. Who would believe us? We had no proof beyond a few muddy footprints that could easily be dismissed as a hoax. And even if we did convince someone, what then? Would they come in with boats and helicopters, trying to capture or kill the creature? As we debated our next move, we heard it again, that same bellowing cry, but this time from the depths of the forest. It sounded farther away, but still too close for comfort. We didn't stick around to investigate further. We piled into Mike's truck and headed back to town, our minds reeling from what we'd experienced. Over the next few days, we grappled with what to do. We scoured the internet for any similar sightings, and sure enough, there were stories. Legends of a monster in Lake Champlain went back centuries. The Native Americans had stories of a great horned serpent that dwelled in the lake. French explorers in the 1600s reported seeing a large, unknown creature in the water. Locals called it Champ, like a freshwater version of the Loch Ness monster. Most people treated it as a fun, local legend, good for tourism and not much else. But we knew the truth. We'd seen it with our own eyes. In the end, we decided to keep quiet, at least for now. We made a pact to return to the lake, to try and gather more evidence. But we agreed to be careful, to respect the creature and its habitat. Whatever this thing was, it had managed to stay hidden for centuries. Maybe there was a reason for that. As the weeks passed, I found myself drawn back to the lake again and again. I'd sit on the shore, watching the water, hoping for another glimpse. Sometimes, when the light was just right, I'd swear I could see something moving out there in the depths. A shadow, a ripple, a hint of something ancient and mysterious. The encounter changed me, changed all of us. We'd seen something that defied explanation, something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. It was terrifying, yes, but also exhilarating. To know that there are still mysteries out there, still wonders to be discovered. I still fish on Lake Champlain. But now, every time I cast my line, I wonder what might be looking back at me from the depths. I wonder about the secrets the water holds, about the creatures that might be watching from just beneath the surface. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the mist rolls in and the lake is still as glass, I swear I can hear that haunting bellow echoing across the water, a reminder that the world is bigger and more mysterious than we can ever truly know, that just beyond the veil of what we understand, there are things that defy explanation, things that have existed long before us and will likely exist long after we're gone. So if you ever find yourself on the shores of Lake Champlain, take a moment to really look out at the water. You might just see something that changes your view of the world forever. Just remember, some secrets are best left undiscovered, and some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, because once you've seen what's out there, you can never unsee it, and that knowledge will stay with you for the rest of your days.